In the dim glow of his office, James Carter sat hunched over his desk, the faint hum of flickering fluorescent lights filling the silence. The city outside buzzed with its usual rhythm, but inside these four walls, time seemed to slow as he stared at the thick case file sprawled before him. The name on the cover thin brown burned into his vision. A 34-year-old black man accused of possessing illegal drugs and an unregistered firearm. To anyone else, it might have looked like just another stack of papers, another routine prosecution in his 10-year career. But to James, something about this one gnawed at him, a quiet unease he couldn't shake loose. He ran his fingers along the edges of the file, the weight of it heavier than it should have been, as if it carried not just ink and paper, but the burden of a man's life teetering on the edge. James wasn't a stranger to the courtroom's harsh realities. As a black prosecutor in a legal system dominated by pale faces and unspoken biases, he'd fought tooth and nail to earn his place. Every trial had been a proving ground not just for the cases he argued, but for his very existence in a world that often refused to see him as equal. He could still feel the sting of his first trial, the way the jury's eyes had lingered on him with skepticism, their whispers barely concealed behind cupped hands, the opposing counsel's smirks. The judge's clipped tonsil of it had fueled a fire in him, a determination to rise above the condescension and carve out a name synonymous with justice. Colleagues called him relentless, a man who wouldn't bend even when the odds were stacked against him. Some admired his grit, others muttered that his success was a fluke, a product of tokenism rather than talent. James didn't care what they thought. He knew the truth. Every victory was a defiance of a system that had tried to define him, long before he'd ever stepped into a courtroom. Now, as he flipped through Ethan's file, that same fire flickered in his chest. The report detailed a traffic stop gone wrong, a spiral into chaos orchestrated by Officer Paul Jennings' name. That sent a chill down James's spine. Jennings was no mystery to him. The cop's reputation preceded him like a dark cloud, hovering over the predominantly black neighborhoods he patrolled with an iron fist. Aggressive, unyielding, and quick to escalate. Jennings had a history that whispered through the street stories of men pulled over for no reason, of evidence that appeared too conveniently, of lives upended by his unchecked power. According to the paperwork, Jennings had stopped Ethan for a broken tail light, claiming he'd found a bag of heroin and a gun in the car. On the surface, it read like a textbook arrest, clean, procedural, airtight. But James knew better than to trust the polished words of a police report. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and rubbed his temples as the pieces refused to fit together. Ethan Brown wasn't a criminal, at least, not the kind the system loved to paint him as. A construction worker, a father, a man scraping by to keep his family afloat. He had no prior record to suggest he'd veer into the world of drugs and guns. James pictured him, calloused hands from long days on the job, shoulders slumped from the weight of responsibility, eyes weary but kind. The evidence against him felt too perfect, too staged, like a script written to ensure a conviction. James's mind churned with questions. Why would a man like Ethan risk everything for a bag of heroin? How had Jennings stumbled upon it so effortlessly? The report offered no answers, just sterile descriptions and a timeline that seemed rehearsed, as if Jennings had recited it 100 times before. There was no mention of a search warrant, no body cam footage to back up the story, no explanation for the gaping holes James could already see. It wasn't just sloppy police work. It was a warning sign, a beacon flashing in the dark. For a moment, James closed his eyes, letting the weight of his own past flood in. He'd grown up hearing tales of injustice, uncles hauled off for crimes they didn't commit, cousins trapped in a cycle of suspicion and punishment, friends whose dreams were snuffed out by a system that saw them as threats rather than people. He'd felt it himself, too, the burn of humiliation when he'd been pulled over in his sleek new car, the officer's questions dripping with accusation as if a black man couldn't possibly belong behind that wheel, the sting of being shadowed in stores, the clerk's eyes tracking his every move. Those moments had scarred him, but they'd also forged him into the man he was now, a prosecutor who refused to let the system grind down those it was meant to protect. Ethan's case wasn't just another file. It was a mirror reflecting every indignity James had ever faced, every fight he'd ever waged. Across town, in the cold, gray confines of the county jail, Ethan Brown sat on a metal bench, his wrists bound by cuffs that bit into his skin. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and despair, the distant clang of cell doors echoing like a heartbeat. His face was a storm of emotion spheres swirling in his wide eyes, resignation etched into the lines round his mouth. When James arrived, briefcase in hand, and took a seat across the scratched plastic table, Ethan barely looked up. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating, until James broke it with a voice steady but firm. "Tell me everything," he said, his pen hovering over a worn notepad, ready to catch every word. Ethan's breath hitched, his gaze flickering nervously round the room as if the walls might betray him. "It's not a long story," he started, his voice low and rough, like gravel underfoot. "I was driving home from work. My tail light's been out for weeks, money's tight, you know? Couldn't fix it. Then this cop pulls me over, starts firing questions at me where I'm going, if I've been drinking. Next thing I know, he's telling me to get out of the car, doesn't ask, just orders. Starts rummaging through my stuff, and out of nowhere, he's holding up this bag of drugs, saying it's mine. Then a gun says he found it too. I've never seen either of those things in my life." His hands clenched into fists, the cuffs rattling faintly. He didn't have a warrant, didn't even pretend he needed one. James scribbled furiously, his brow creasing deeper with every word. He'd heard this tune before, played out in different keys, but always with the same bitter notes, a routine stop, a sudden escalation, evidence materializing like magic. "The officer's name Paul Jennings?" he asked, his tone sharp, testing the waters. Ethan nodded, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Yeah, that's him. Everyone in my neighborhood knows him. They say if Jennings pulls you over, you're done. Doesn't matter if you're clean, he'll make sure you're not by the time he's through." The words hung in the air, a quiet indictment of a man who wielded his badge like a weapon. James leaned back, his mind racing. Jennings wasn't just a rogue cop. He was a fixture, a cog in a machine that churned out convictions to keep the powerless in check. Over the years, James had seen his name crop up in complaints, excessive force, racial profiling, arrests that stank of fabrication. Yet Jennings always walked away unscathed, shielded by a system that turned a blind eye to its own rot. The lesson was clear: power, unchecked, bred corruption, and justice became a casualty of convenience. Back in his office, James pored over Jennings's incident report, the words blurring into a cold, clinical narrative. The stop had been initiated for a broken tail light, fair enough. But then it veered into shaky territory. Ethan had acted nervous and evasive, giving Jennings probable cause to search under the driver's seat, a bag of heroin. In the glove compartment, a gun. Neat, tidy, damning to damning. James read it again, his eyes narrowing at the omissions. No warrant, no footage, no witnesses. Just Jennings's word, polished and precise, like a story he'd told a dozen times before. It reeked of rehearsal, of a man who knew the system would back him no matter the truth. He picked up the phone, his voice clipped as he dialed his assistant, Mia. "Pull everything we have on Jennings," he said. "Disciplinary records, past arrests, lawsuits, anything you can dig up." Mia's response crackled through the line, her tone laced with curiosity. "You think this is another one of his setups?" James exhaled, the weight of the case settling deeper into his bones. "It's starting to look that way." The next morning, Mia dropped a towering stack of documents onto his desk, her usually bright demeanor subdued. She was young, sharp, and fiercely loyal, a law student who'd seen enough of the world to know its flaws, but still believed it could be fixed. "This guy's a piece of work," she said, tapping the pile. "Complaints going back years, but nothing sticks. It's like he's untouchable." James nodded, flipping through the pages. Each report was a snapshot of Jennings's reign. A father roughed up in front of his kids, a teenager cuffed for resisting a search that never should have happened, a grandmother whose car was torn apart on a hunch that led nowhere. The pattern was undeniable, and yet the consequences were non-existent. As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the skyline in hues of orange and shadow, James made his choice. He'd take the cassonade just to defend Ethan. but to dismantle the lie Jennings had built. It was a risk, a gamble that could cost him his career, maybe more. Accusing a cop like Jennings meant wading into a viper's nest, challenging a system that protected its own at all costs. But James had never shied away from a fight, especially not one that struck at the heart of everything he'd sworn to stand for. Justice wasn't just a word to him, it was a promise, a lifeline for men like Ethan who'd been left to drown. He shot a quick text to me, a call, Ethan Brown, first thing tomorrow. I'm taking the case, then grabbed his coat and stepped into the night. The air was crisp, the city sprawling before him like a battlefield of light and shadow. This wasn't just another case, it was personal, it was a reckoning. And James Carter was ready to see it through, no matter how deep the corruption ran or how fiercely the system fought back. For Ethan, for himself, for every soul crushed under the weight of unchecked power. He'd shine a light into the darkness and let justice burn through the lies. James Carter sat hunched over his cluttered desk, the dim glow of his lamp casting long shadows across the room. His fingers traced the edges of a worn file, one of many that had begun to pile up like a fortress of paper around him. Each document whispered a piece of Officer Paul Jennings' story, and the deeper James dug, the more a chilling pattern emerged. Over the past 5 years, Jennings had been tied to at least a dozen arrests, each one eerily ordinary traffic stops that spiraled into dramatic drug busts, almost always pinning black drivers under the weight of suspicious charges. Complaints had trickled in over the years, voices of outrage muffled by a system that seemed to shrug them off. Jennings, somehow, remained untouchable, a phantom shielded by an invisible armor of authority. James leaned back in his chair, raking his hands through his hair, the strands slipping through his fingers like threads of a fraying resolve. If Jennings was planting evidence, as James suspected, exposing him wouldn't just be about saving Ethan Brown, it would mean confronting a sprawling, complicit machine that had let this man roam free. The stakes loomed like a storm cloud, dark and heavy, threatening to drown James' career if he misstepped. That afternoon, James found himself in a modest home on the city's edge, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and quiet desperation. Linda Brown, Ethan's mother, sat across from him, her petite frame dwarfed by an oversized armchair. Her eyes, rimmed with exhaustion, flickered with a fragile hope as her hands twisted together in her lap. Ethan's not a bad kid, she said, her voice quivering like a leaf caught in the wind. He's fought so hard to stay on the right path. It doesn't add up. Her words hung between them, fragile and pleading. James met her gaze, choosing his response with the care of a man stepping through a minefield. Mrs. Brown, he began, his tone soft but steady. I'll be straight with you. The evidence against Ethan looks damning, but there are cracks in this case, things that don't fit. I'm convinced there's more here than they're letting on, and I'm going to dig until I find it. Linda's eyes welled up, tears spilling over as she whispered, "Thank you. I just need someone to see him the way I do." As James drove back to his office, the hum of the engine couldn't drown out the echoes of the case replaying in his mind. No warrant, no body cam footage, evidence so pristine it felt staged. Every detail pointed to one conclusion: Ethan had been framed. Proving it, though, was a beast of its own, a dangerous dance with a system that guarded its own like a fortress. That night, James dialed Mia, his voice cutting through the static of the line with quiet urgency. "We need to go deeper," he said, the words sharp with determination. "Pull every arrest Jennings has made in the last year, some neighborhoods, same charges. Check for complaints, anything that ties them together." Mia's pause crackled over the phone, her hesitation palpable. "James, if you're right about this, it's not just risky, it could explode in our faces." He exhaled, his breath steady despite the weight pressing on his chest. "I know, but if I'm right, Ethan's not the only one caught in this web. And if we don't act, it'll keep swallowing lives." The next morning, a thick envelope arrived from a shadowy source, a fellow attorney, who'd tangled with Jennings in court and lived to regret it. Inside were sworn affidavits, each page a testament from someone claiming Jennings had slipped drugs or weapons into their lives. Like a thief in the night, as James pored over the statements, his gut churned with a mix of dread and resolve. Jennings wasn't just a lone predator, was a symptom of a sickness festering in the system. a rot that ran deeper than one man. The question gnawed at him. How could he unravel this without jeopardizing Ethan's fragile chance at freedom? Later, James dialed Ethan at the jail, the cold beep of the line connecting them like a lifeline stretched thin. When Ethan's voice came through, it was soft but laced with steel. "We're fighting this," James said, his words a vow. "I need you to trust me and hold on. It's going to get ugly. Jennings won't back down easy, but I swear we'll get to the truth." Ethan's reply was quiet, almost swallowed by the hum of the prison walls. "I trust you, Mr. Carter. I just want my life back." Hanging up, James felt the gravity of the road ahead settle into his bones. This wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about every soul crushed under the heel of a system that turned a blind eye to its own corruption. Justice wasn't just a word. It was a fire now, burning in his chest, demanding to be fed. The air in James' office grew heavier as Mia slipped in, her steps soft but deliberate, a new folder clutched in her hands. "This just came in," she said, her voice low, as if the walls might eavesdrop. "Civilian complaints against Jennings. It's a mess." James flipped it open, his eyes scanning the litany of accusations: excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation. Page after page, the same refrain: insufficient evidence. The phrase mocked him, repeated so often it felt like a chant designed to bury the truth. "He's been untouchable," James muttered, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. Mia's eyes flashed with defiance. "Untouchable doesn't mean innocent." A faint, grim smile tugged at James' lips. "No, it doesn't. But it means we're in for a hell of a fight." As he sifted through the complaints, the pattern sharpened into focus. Jennings preyed on young black men. His arrests a twisted script routine, stops ballooning into felony charges, only for many to later unravel under scrutiny. It was too clean, too rehearsed, a predator's choreography hidden behind a badge. Desperate for a lead, James called Claire Harrow, an attorney who'd once crossed swords with Jennings in court. Her voice came through the line, cautious and clipped. "James Carter," she said, as if testing the waters. "What do you need? Tell me about Jennings." He pressed. "I've got a client who might be his latest target." Claire's sigh was heavy with memory. "I can't promise much help. Jennings is a ghost. Every time we pushed, the brass shut us down. He's got a guardian angel." "Who?" James asked, his pulse quickening. "Lieutenant Brian Merrow," she replied, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "His supervisor. Merrow's been covering for him for years. Sheem and his buddies in the DA's office." James' anger flared, a hot spark in his chest. Merrow's name rang like a warning bell, a man known for fierce loyalty to his officers, even when it meant trampling accountability underfoot. "We had everything," Claire went on, frustration seeping through. "Witnesses, evidence, depositions. Merrow dismantled it all, discredited everyone who spoke up. You're wading into deep waters, James. I've never been afraid of a little water." He shot back, his resolve hardening. "Thanks, Claire." Hanging up, he felt the enormity of the fight sink in. Jennings wasn't the only giant he'd have to slay. Merrow and his web of influence loomed just as large. The next day, James met Thomas Keller, a retired detective who'd served under Merrow before walking away from the force. They sat in a quiet diner, the clink of dishes a faint backdrop to Keller's hushed confession. His eyes darted nervously, as if expecting shadows to materialize. "Jennings is dirty," he said, his voice blunt but trembling. "Always has been. But Merrow's the puppet master. Keeps Jennings on the streets, no matter what." James leaned closer, the vinyl booth creaking under him. "Why's no one called it out?" Keller's laugh was dry, bitter. "Fear. Merrow doesn't just protect his own, he crushes anyone who gets in his way. I've seen good cops ruined for less." James' jaw tightened, his mind racing. The cost of this battle was rising, a steep cliff he'd have to climb, with no safety net. That evening, back in his office, his phone buzzed with a blocked number. "Carter," a deep voice growled. "Drop the Jennings case. You don't want this fight." "Who's this?" James demanded, his grip on the phone whitening his knuckles. "Someone giving you a heads up," the voice sneered. "Walk away, or you'll wish you had." The line cut dead, leaving James staring into the silence, his heart hammering. The threat was a gauntlet thrown, a signal that someone powerful was watching. Undeterred, James turned to Mia the next morning, his eyes blazing with purpose. "We need everything on Merrow. If he's shielding Jennings, we prove it." Mia's brow furrowed, doubt flickering in her gaze. "James, if Merrow's in this, it's not just one bad cop. This could ruin us. I didn't sign up to play it safe," he replied, his voice like iron. "If they're tearing lives apart, we rip the mask off no matter who's behind it." Later, an unexpected ally slipped into his office, a Detective Eric Dawson, a young officer from Jennings' precinct. His hands trembled as he shut the door, his face pale with nerves. "I don't have long," he said, glancing back as if hunted. "I've seen what Jennings does. I can't stomach it anymore." James studied him, searching for cracks. "Why now?" Dawson ran a hand through his hair, exhaling shakily. "Because it's wrong, and you're the only one who might stop him." He slid a USB drive across the desk. "Internal reports, arrest logs, complaints that got buried. It's not everything, but it's something." James took it, a spark of hope igniting. "This could change things, Detective. Thank you." That night, the phone rang again, this time. Jennings himself. "Carter," he drawled, his voice thick with menace and mockery. "You think you're clever, huh? Digging into my past, looking for dirt. You're wasting your breath." "Am I?" James replied, his tone cool as steel. Jennings' laugh was a jagged edge. "You've got no idea who you're tangling with. This goes deeper than you can imagine." "I know enough," James fired back, "and I'm not stopping until it's all out in the open." The line crackled with Jennings' fury. "Think about your future, Carter. You're playing a dangerous game." The call ended, but the threat lingered like smoke. James sat back, the weight of justice and consequence pressing down. This wasn't just a case, it was a reckoning, a lesson in the cost of power unchecked and the courage it took to demand accountability. For Ethan, for the others silenced, he'd fight on, no matter how fierce the storm. The air in the dimly lit parking garage hung heavy with the scent of gasoline and damp concrete as James Carter's footsteps reverberated off the walls, each echo a sharp reminder of the long, grueling day he'd endured. The weight of countless meetings and tense phone calls pressed down on his shoulders, his mind buzzing with fragments of evidence he'd been painstakingly assembling. It was all for one purpose: to dismantle the corrupt empire shielding Paul Jennings, a man who wore his badge like a crown and wielded his authority like a weapon. In James's hand, the USB drive from Detective Dawson felt like a fragile life, a critical breakthrough. Yes, but nowhere near enough to topple a figure as entrenched as Jennings. This wasn't just a crooked cop. This was a predator cloaked in the system's protection. A man who thrived because those above him turned a blind eye. As James approached his car, his heart thudded unevenly, not from exhaustion, but from the sight of a silhouette leaning lazily against his driver's side door. Paul Jennings straightened as James drew near, his posture casual, but his presence suffocating. The smirk tugging at his lips was a hollow thing, never reaching the icy, calculating depths of his eyes. He stood there as if the world belonged to him, unshaken, untouchable. A man who'd danced through life with nothing to fear. "Late night, Carter," Jennings drawled, his voice dripping with mockery, each syllable laced with a taunting edge. "Seems like you've been burning the midnight oil. Chasing ghosts must be exhausting." James didn't flinch, though his pulse quickened. He squared his shoulders, meeting Jennings's gaze with a steely resolve that masked the storm brewing inside him. "What do you want, Jennings?" he asked, his tone clipped but steady. Refusing to give the man an inch, Jennings took a deliberate step closer, invading James's space with the confidence of a bully who'd never been challenged. His voice stayed light, almost playful, but the words carried a razor-sharp threat. "Word is, you've been poking around in my past, chatting with folks you've got no business talking to. That's a dangerous game, Carter. Not a smart move for a man like you." James held his ground, his dark eyes locked on Jennings's, unflinching despite the unease coiling in his gut. "If you've got nothing to hide, you wouldn't be standing here sweating over it," he shot back, his voice calm but edged with defiance. A low, menacing chuckle rumbled from Jennings's chest, the sound slithering through the air like a warning. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you, riding in to save the day, one lost cause at a time. But let me tell you something, heroes don't last long around here. They either fade away or, well, worse. His smirk widened, a predator baring its teeth. James crossed his arms, his posture unwavering, though his mind raced with the implications of every word. Are you threatening me? He asked, his voice dropping to a quiet, unyielding firmness that belied the fury simmering beneath. Jennings's grin stretched, but it was a brittle thing, hiding something colder, a threat. No, just a friendly heads up. You've got a nice little career, a shiny reputation. Be a real shame to watch it all crumble over a fight you can't win. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against the chilled night air. Think about it, Carter. James didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, closing the gap, his voice a low, resolute whisper that cut through the tension like a blade. If you think you can scare me off, you're wasting your breath. This isn't about a story, it's about the truth, and I'm going to drag it into the light, whether you like it or not. For a fleeting moment, Jennings's mask slipped. The smug arrogance gave way to something raw and dangerous, a flicker of rage or fear or both flashing in his eyes. He leaned in, his voice barely a hiss. Careful, Carter, you've got a family, don't you? A cozy little life. Don't make this personal. James's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking beneath the surface as he fought to keep his composure. The mention of his family sent a jolt of protective anger through him, but he refused to let Jennings see it. You made it personal the second you framed Ethan Brown, he said, his words sharp and deliberate. I'm not backing down. Jennings lingered there, his gaze boring into James as if sizing him up, weighing whether this was a bluff or a breaking point. Then, with a mocking shake of his head, he stepped back, the smirk returning like a shield. Suit yourself, he said, turning on his heel. But don't say I didn't warn you. His footsteps faded into the shadows, leaving behind a silence that pressed against James's chest like a physical weight. For a long moment, James stood by his car, his breath fogging in the cool night air. Jennings's words had been a calculated jab, designed to plant seeds of doubt and fear. But instead of crumbling, James felt a fire ignite within him, a fierce, unyielding determination. This wasn't just about Ethan Brown anymore, the innocent man Jennings had tried to bury with planted evidence. This was about a system rotten to its core, about justice denied, and about the cost of letting men like Jennings wield power unchecked. He slid into his car, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened, already plotting his next move. Back in his cluttered office, the glow of a single desk lamp cast long shadows across the room as James recounted the encounter. To Mia Torres, his sharp-witted colleague, she paced the hardwood floor, her boots clicking with every step, her brow furrowed in thought. He's trying to get under your skin, she said, her voice low but urgent, her hands gesturing animatedly. He wants you to second-guess yourself, to think this fight's too big, too messy. Classic intimidation. James leaned back in his chair, the creak of the old wood punctuating the quiet. It's more than that, he replied, his tone heavy with certainty. He's rattled. He knows I'm closing in on something real, something he can't bury this time. That's why he's out there playing mind games. Mia stopped mid-stride, turning to face him, her dark eyes searching his face. So what's the plan? You're not seriously thinking of letting this slide, are you? Double down, James said without hesitation, his voice firm and resolute. If Jennings thinks he can rattle me, he's got a hell of a surprise coming. I'm not stopping until he's exposed every lie, every frame-up, every life he's ruined. The next morning, James found himself in a cramped, bustling coffee shop, the air thick with the aroma of roasted beans and the hum of overlapping conversations. Across from him sat Clara Harlow, an attorney with a reputation for tenacity and a personal grudge against Jennings that ran deep. Her sharp features were softened by the steam rising from her cup, but her eyes burned with a quiet intensity. He came to you directly, she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief as she leaned forward, her fingers tapping the edge of the table. James nodded, his expression grim. Last night, made it clear he wants me to back off. Even hinted he'd go after my family if I don't. Clara exhaled sharply, a sound of frustration and recognition. That's his playbook: intimidation. Threats, anything to keep people quiet. He's done it before, James. Too many times. Her gaze hardened, memories of past battles flickering behind her eyes. "Not this time," James said, his voice cutting through the noise of the shop. "I need more. Clara, something concrete. The USB drive's a start, but it's not enough to nail him." Clara leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Have you dug into his case history? The last 5 years, specifically. There's a pattern: some arrests, same convenient outcomes. If you can connect the dots, you might prove he's been cooking evidence on a scale bigger than anyone realizes." "I've started," James admitted, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "But it's like wading through quicksand. His supervisor, Merrow, has buried half the complaints under red tape and excuses. I need a way past him." Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup before she reached into her bag. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table with a cautious glance around the room. "This might help," she said quietly. "It's a list of people who've filed complaints against Jennings. Most got swept under the rug, but a few might talk if you approach them right." James unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the names scrawled in Clara's neat handwriting. A spark of hope flared in his chest. "Thank you, Clara," he said, meeting her gaze with gratitude. "This could be the break I've been waiting for." That evening, the sun dipped low over the city's outskirts as James pulled up to a modest house, its faded paint peeling under the weight of years. He knocked on the door, the sound sharp against the stillness, and after a tense pause, it creaked open. Michael Reed stood there, a young man in his early 20s with wary eyes and a frame that seemed too thin for his height. "Yeah," he said, his tone guarded, his hand gripping the door like a shield. "Michael Reed," James asked, keeping his voice steady but warm. "My name's James Carter. I'm a prosecutor looking into Paul Jennings. I heard you might know something about him." Michael's eyes darted over James's shoulder, scanning the empty street as if expecting trouble. "Why do you care?" he asked, suspicion thick in his voice. James took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "Because Jennings has been planting evidence and destroying lives, people like you. People like Ethan Brown. I'm trying to stop him, but I need help. Your help." Michael's fingers drummed against the doorframe, a nervous rhythm that betrayed the conflict raging inside him. After a long, agonizing moment, he stepped aside. "Comin'," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Inside, the living room was sparse, the air stale with the weight of unspoken pain. Michael sank into a worn couch, his hands clasped tightly as he spoke. 2 years ago, Jennings had pulled him over, claiming a routine stop. Next thing Michael knew, he was cuffed and charged with drug possession, drugs he'd never touched. The case fell apart when the evidence vanished, but not before Michael had languished in jail for months, his life unraveling thread by thread. "He ruined me," Michael said, his voice cracking with bitterness. "Even after it was dropped, people still treated me like trash. Lost my job, my friends, everything." James scribbled notes, his pen moving furiously as Michael's story poured out. Every word was another shard of the mosaic he was building, another testament to Jennings's abuse of power. "Will you testify?" James asked, looking up with quiet urgency. Michael hesitated, his eyes flickering with fear and defiance. "If it'll take him down, yeah. But you better be ready. Jennings doesn't go quiet." "I'm ready," James said, his voice a vow as much to himself as to Michael. Later, as James left the house, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Mia lit up the screen. "We found something. Dawson just sent body cam footage Jennings tried to wipe. You need to see this." Adrenaline surged through him, sharp and electric. The net was tightening around Jennings. But James knew the real battle was still ahead, a battle for justice, for the truth, and for the lives crushed under the weight of unchecked power. Days later, the courtroom buzzed with a restless energy as James adjusted his tie, the fabric slick against his clammy palms. He rose from his seat, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, jurors rigid with anticipation, spectators whispering in the gallery, and across the aisle, Richard Blake, the opposing prosecutor, lounging with an arrogance that grated on James's nerves. Stepping to the center, James let the silence stretch, a deliberate pause that sharpened the air before he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady but resonant. filling the space with quiet authority. This case isn't what it appears to be. Ethan Brown isn't the monster he's been painted as. He's a man who works hard, who loves his daughter, who's woven into the fabric of this community. Yet here he stands, accused of crimes he didn't commit. Why? Because he was targeted. Because evidence was fabricated. Because the system meant to shield us has, in this moment, betrayed him. Blake shifted, a faint smirk tugging at his lips, but James pressed on, his focus locked on the jury's unreadable faces. This isn't about guilt or innocence, it's about truth. Ethan Brown was ensnared by an officer with a trail of misconduct stretching back years, racial bias, planted evidence, lives destroyed for the sake of power. The so-called evidence against Ethan, it's not just flimsy, it's a lie. By the end of this trial, you'll see that Ethan isn't the criminal here. He's the victim of a system that protects the wrong people. The room held its breath as James returned to his seat, his heart pounding with the weight of what he'd just set in motion. Blake rose smoothly, his voice polished and commanding as he countered with a narrative of order and duty. But James barely heard it. His mind was on the bigger fight in Jennings, on the corruption he embodied, and on the lesson etched into every step of this journey. Power, when abused, demands a reckoning. And justice, though hard-won, is the only cure for a broken system. The courtroom buzzed with an electric tension, the air thick with the weight of unspoken truths as the trial unfolded. Ethan Brown sat silently at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his dark eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and resignation. He was a young man from a neighborhood where hope often felt like a distant rumor, and now he found himself ensnared in a legal trap he couldn't fully comprehend. Across the room, Prosecutor Blake paced with the confidence of a predator circling its prey, his tailored suit crisp and his voice honed to a razor's edge. He turned sharply toward the jury, his gaze sweeping over their face, some weary, some attentive, all searching for clarity in the chaos of testimony and evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blake began, his tone shifting from calm authority to a pressing urgency that seemed to vibrate through the wooden benches. "The facts here are straightforward, undeniable. Ethan Brown was caught in the act, throwing stashed beneath his driver's seat, an unregistered firearm tucked into his glove compartment. These aren't the hallmarks of an innocent man going about his day. No, these are the deliberate choices of a criminal, a threat lurking in our streets, endangering the very fabric of our community." His words landed like stones, each one carefully chosen to stoke the jury's deepest fears of danger, of disorder, of the unknown. He painted Ethan not as a person, but as a specter, a shadowy figure whose mere existence justified their unease. James Carter, Ethan's attorney, sat a few feet away, his pen scratching furiously across a yellow legal pad. He observed the jury with a hawk-like intensity, noting every twitch of a brow, every slight lean forward or back. Some jurors furrowed their foreheads, skepticism etched into their expressions, while others nodded faintly, swayed by Blake's calculated rhetoric. As Blake strode back to his seat, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor, James felt the atmosphere tilt. He'd anticipated this. Blake's gift wasn't just in presenting evidence, but in bending it, molding it into a narrative so compelling it could obscure the truth beneath layers of fear and assumption. Justice, James thought bitterly, wasn't always the goal here. Winning was. The judge's gavel cracked through the hum of the room, calling the first witness. Officer Paul Jennings rose from his chair, his broad shoulders squared, his uniform pressed to perfection. He moved toward the stand with the swagger of a man who believed the world bent to his will, his boots thudding softly against the floor. As he settled into the witness chair and raised his right hand to swear the oath, his eyes gleamed with a quiet arrogance. It was untouchable, or so he thought. Blake approached, his movements deliberate, pacing slowly as if savoring the moment. "Officer Jennings," Blake said, his voice smooth and inviting, "could you please take us through the events of the night in question, step by step, for the jury's benefit?" Jennings nodded, his posture relaxed, his tone steady as still water. "Of course," he replied, folding his hands neatly in his lap. "I was on patrol, driving down Maple Street, when I noticed the defendant's vehicle, a beat-up sedan with a busted tail light flickering in the dark. It's a small thing, but it's my job to notice." So I flipped on my lights, pulled him over. When I approached the driver's window, Ethan Brown was behind the wheel, and right away, I could tell something was off. He wouldn't meet my eyes, kept shifting in his seat like he was sitting on pins. His hands trembled as he handed over his license, and his voice cracked when he spoke. Based on my years of training, those are red flag signs of someone hiding something. I had a hunch there might be contraband in the car, so I asked him to step out. When I searched the vehicle, I found the heroin tucked under the driver's seat and the gun in the glove box, plain as day. Blake nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, as if Jennings had just recited a script they'd rehearsed a dozen times. And was there anything unusual about this stop? He pressed, leaning slightly toward the witness. Jennings shook his head, his expression unwavering. No, sir, it was routine. Just another night on the job. James scribbled a single word on his pad, routine. He underlined it twice, the ink bleeding slightly into the paper. Routine. He thought, let's see how that holds up. When Blake sat down, the room seemed to exhale, and all eyes turned to James as he rose for cross-examination. The shift was palpable. Jennings straightened in his seat, his jaw tightening, his fingers curling slightly as James approached. The officer's earlier confidence dimmed, replaced by a wary glint in his eyes, like a man bracing for a storm he hadn't anticipated. Officer Jennings, James began, his voice low but piercing. Cutting through the courtroom's stillness, you've described this traffic stop as routine. Is that right? Yes, Jennings answered, his response clipped, almost defiant. James tilted his head, his expression calm, but laced with a subtle challenge. And yet, during this so-called routine stop, you conducted a search of Mr. Brown's vehicle without a warrant. Can you walk us through why you felt that was justified? Jennings hesitated, a flicker of unease darting across his face, so brief it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not watching as closely as James. Like I said, he replied, his tone hardening. The defendant was acting suspicious. He wouldn't look at me, kept fidgeting. That gave me probable cause to search. Probable cause, James echoed, letting the phrase linger as he turned slightly toward the jury, ensuring they felt its weight. That's an interesting choice of words. Can you point to anything concrete? Video footage from a dash cam or body cam that backs up your claim of suspicious behavior. Jennings stiffened, his shoulders squaring as if to shield himself. Body cam footage wasn't available that night, he said, his voice flat, rehearsed. James raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into the faintest hint of a smirk. Convenient, he said dryly, pausing to let the words sink in. So we're just supposed to trust your account, your word alone? Jennings glared, his eyes narrowing into slits, but he didn't respond. James seized the silence like a weapon. Officer Jennings, he continued, his tone sharpening. Are you aware that multiple complaints have been filed against you over the years, allegations of misconduct, including planting evidence? Blake leaped to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Objection. That's irrelevant and inflammatory, he barked, his face flushing with indignation. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, peered over her glasses. She considered for a moment, her fingers tapping lightly on the bench. Overruled. She said finally, "Proceed, Mr. Carter." James turned back to Jennings, his gaze unrelenting. "I'll ask Again, are you aware of these complaints?" Jennings shifted uncomfortably, his hands clenching into fists. "I've heard about them," he admitted, his voice tight, "but none of them were substantiated." "None substantiated," James repeated slowly, his eyes flicking to the jury. "So you've never faced any real consequences for these allegations, have you?" "No," Jennings snapped, his composure fraying at the edges. James let the silence stretch, heavy and accusing, before delivering his final blow. "Isn't it true, Officer Jennings, that you have a history of targeting people like Ethan Brown, young black men from certain neighborhoods under the guise of these routine stops?" Blake objected again, his voice booming, but the damage was done. The jury's eyes darted between James and Jennings, doubt creeping into their expressions like cracks spreading across thin ice. Some leaned forward, their brows furrowed, while others exchanged furtive glances, wrestling with the implications of what they'd just heard. As the day drew to a close, The courtroom buzzed with a restless energy. The jurors filed out, their faces a mosaic of reactions. Some seemed swayed by Blake's portrait of Ethan as a menace, while others appeared shaken by James's dismantling of Jennings's credibility. James gathered his papers, his movements slow and deliberate, when Mia, his paralegal, leaned over. Her dark curls brushed his shoulder as she whispered, "You got them thinking. They're questioning him now. That's something." James nodded, but his jaw tightened. "It's a start," he said quietly, "but it's not enough. This trial was a battlefield, and Jennings still had too many pawns shielding him. Blake's silver tongue, a system that rarely doubted its own, and a lack of hard evidence to tip the scales. James needed more than doubt. He needed a revelation, a piece of undeniable truth that would shatter Blake's carefully constructed lie and expose Jennings for the predator he was, a man who wielded power not to serve justice, but to corrupt it. As he left the courthouse, the evening air cool against his skin, James's mind churned. The stakes were higher than one man's freedom. This was about the cost of unchecked authority, about the lives quietly crushed beneath its weight. Jennings wasn't just a rogue cough, was a symptom of a deeper rot, a warning of what happened when power went unquestioned. James vowed to find the key or witness, a record, something to bring it all crashing down. The next day, as he approached the stand again, Jennings sat rigid, his knuckles white against the wood. The officer's earlier bravado had faded, replaced by a brittle tension that seemed to hum beneath his skin. "Let's go back to that night," James said, his voice steady but probing, like a surgeon's scalpel seeking a vein. "You pulled Mr. Brown over for a broken tail light." "Correct." "Yes," Jennings replied, his answer curt, his eyes locked on James with a mix of defiance and dread. "And you said he seemed nervous, evasive, which led you to search his car. Can you paint us a picture? What did that nervousness look like? Was he sweating, stammering, fidgeting?" Jennings faltered, his tongue darting out to wet his lips. He wouldn't look me in the eye," he said, his voice less certain now. He kept moving around in his seat. James tilted his head, feigning curiosity. "Would you say that's unusual? That some inanimate feel jittery when a police officer pulls them over, especially late at night, with lights flashing and a uniform looming at their window?" Jennings's lips pressed into a thin line, his irritation flaring. "I suppose it's possible," he conceded, the words dragged out of him. "Possible," James repeated, turning to the jury with a slight nod. "But you took that possibility and ran with it, used it as an excuse to search his car, without a warrant. It wasn't just nervousness though, was it? You said his behavior matched a profile. What profile? Exactly. Or was it more of a hunch, a presumption you made about who Ethan Brown was?" Jennings shifted, a bead of sweat glistening at his temple. "I acted on my training," he said, his voice rising slightly. His behavior fit the pattern of someone hiding something. "Your training," James said, stepping closer, his tone hardening. "You've been on the force for over 10 years, haven't you? Hundreds, maybe thousands of stops under your belt. How many of those ended with you finding drugs or guns without a warrant?" Blake shot up again, objection irrelevant. The judge sighed, her patience thinning. "Rephrase, Mr. Carter." James didn't miss a beat. "Officer Jennings, is it standard in your department to search a car based solely on a hunch and perceived nervousness with any warrant or backup?" Jennings hesitated, his eyes darting to Blake as if seeking rescue. "It depends on the situation," he said finally, his voice weaker now. "The situation," James pressed, his gaze unrelenting. "Let's talk about this situation. You said you found heroin under the seat, a gun in the glove box. Did anyone else see you pull those items out? Another officer? A bystander?" "No," Jennings admitted, his reluctance palpable. "It was just me. No dash cam, no body cam." James continued, his voice rising slightly. "You've said the footage wasn't available, so it's your word alone. The word of a man with a trail of complaints behind him." Blake objected again, his voice a thunderclap, but the judge waved him off. "Answer the question," she said sternly. Jennings's composure cracked, his face flushing. "Those complaints were baseless," he spat. "None of them stuck." "Baseless," James said, letting the word hang like a guillotine blade. "Tell me, Officer Jennings, How many of those complaints were investigated by someone outside your department's own impartial? Jennings faltered, his hands twitching. I don't know, he muttered, his defiance crumbling. You don't know, James said, his tone dripping with skepticism, or you don't want to admit it. He pivoted sharply. One last thing, where's the chain of custody for that evidence? Why isn't there a single document showing who handled it from the moment you found it? Jennings opened his mouth, then closed it, his eyes wide with the panic of a man caught in a lie he couldn't untangle. It was logged later. He stammered, the words tumbling out like broken glass. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of his answer settling over the jury like a storm cloud. James stepped back, his point made, but his mind raced. This wasn't just about Ethan, it was about the countless others Jennings had likely targeted. About a system that let power fester into corruption. Justice demanded more than a verdict, it demanded accountability. A reckoning for those who twisted the law into a weapon. And James wouldn't stop until he'd carved that truth into the open. In the dimly lit courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation as James Carter's voice sliced through the silence, sharp and deliberate. Let's go over this again, Officer Jennings, he said, his tone carrying an edge that made the jury sit up straighter. Who was responsible for logging the evidence in this case? His eyes locked onto the officer, watching every twitch of his face. Jennings shifted uncomfortably in the witness stand, his uniform suddenly feeling too tight around his broad shoulders. I handled it, he admitted, his voice low, almost reluctant, as if the words were being pried out of him. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of the stand, betraying a nervousness he couldn't fully mask. James turned slowly toward the jury, his movements calculated, letting the weight of Jennings' admission hang in the air. So, to make this crystal clear for everyone, he began, his voice rising just enough to command every ear in the room. We're looking at a case with no body camera footage to back it up, no witnesses to confirm what happened, and no search warrant to justify the officer's actions, and the only thread connecting my client, Mr. Ethan Brown, to these so-called crimes is the word of one man. He paused, gesturing toward Jennings, an officer with a documented history of bending the rules. The prosecutor, Blake, shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making an argument, not asking a question. His voice was firm, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes, as if he sensed the ground shifting beneath him. Sustained, the judge replied, her tone clipped as she adjusted her glasses, peering down at James with a look that said she'd tolerate no theatrics. Mr. Carter, stick to questioning. James nodded respectfully but didn't miss a beat. He pivoted back to Jennings, his gaze piercing. One last thing, officer. Have you ever verplanted evidence during a traffic stop? His words landed like a hammer, each syllable deliberate, daring Jennings to lie. Jennings's face flushed a deep crimson, his jaw tightening as if he could grind the accusation into dust with his teeth. Absolutely not. Never, he snapped, but his voice cracked on the last word, rising in pitch. The courtroom fell silent, the tension so thick it seemed to press against the walls. James let it linger, his eyes scanning the jury as they absorbed the officer's faltering composure. Then, with a subtle nod, he stepped back and returned to his seat, leaving the moment to fester in everyone's mind. During the recess, James and his co-counsel, Mia Torres, slipped into a small, windowless room down the hall. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paper, a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere they'd just left. Mia leaned against the table, her dark eyes gleaming with a mix of excitement and urgency. You got under his skin out there, she said, her voice hushed but buzzing with energy. The jury saw I was lying, and they knew it. You could see it in their faces. James didn't share her enthusiasm. He paced the cramped space, his shoes tapping a restless rhythm on the linoleum floor. It's not enough, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. Blake's going to twist this into me bullying a decorated cop. Without something concrete, something they can't spin, we're still on shaky ground. His mind raced, replaying Jennings's red-faced denial, the way his hands had gripped the stand like a lifeline. There had to be more. Mia reached into her bag and pulled out a thin folder, sliding it across the table with a quiet confidence. Detective Dawson just sent this over," she said. "It's an internal memo from Jennings's department. Take a look. There are inconsistencies in his case reports going back 3 years. Dates don't line up, evidence logs are sloppy. If we can connect this to Ethan's case." James snatched the folder, flipping it open with a hunger in his eyes. The pages were a mess of bureaucratic jargon, but as he scanned them, patterns emerged, evidence appearing out of thin air, no witnesses to back it up. Cases that smelled suspiciously like setups. His pulse quickened. "This could be the break we need," he said, his voice low but firm. "But we've got to play it smart. If the jury sees this pattern, Jennings's word crumbles. He's done." Back in the courtroom, the mood shifted as James rose to present the memo. The jury leaned forward in their seats, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Pencils poised over notepads. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead the only sound as James held the document aloft. "This," he said, his voice steady and commanding, "is a record of irregularities in Officer Jennings's arrest reports across multiple cases. Evidence that materializes after the fact, with no one to verify how it got there. And in every single instance, the suspects share one detail: they are from minority neighborhoods." Jennings's expression darkened, his hands clenching the stand so hard his knuckles turned white. He looked like a man watching his carefully built world begin to crack. Blake leapt up again, his voice booming. "Your Honor, this is nothing but a smear campaign against a dedicated officer." James turned to the judge, his posture unwavering. "Your Honor, this isn't about smearing anyone. This is about a pattern of behavior that directly ties to my client's case. The jury has a right to see the whole truth, not just the polished version." His words carried a quiet intensity, a plea for justice rooted in reason. The judge's eyes narrowed as she considered, her fingers tapping lightly on her bench. "Overruled." She said at last, "Proceed, Mr. Carter." Facing the jury again, James squared his shoulders. "This isn't about attacking law enforcement," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "This is about holding power to account. Officer Jennings has operated for years under the belief that no one would dare question him. Today, we're proving that belief wrong." His eyes met Jennings's, and for a moment, the officer's mask of authority slipped, revealing a flicker of fear, of a man who knew the tide was turning against him. As the court adjourned for the day, James stepped into the cool evening air outside the courthouse, the weight of the fight pressing down on him. He'd scored a hit, exposed the cracks in Jennings's story, but he felt no triumphantly the gnawing certainty that the real battle still lay ahead. He needed something undeniable, a final strike to shatter the lies completely. His phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him from his thoughts. The screen lit up with the name Derek Walker. James's heart skipped a beat. Derek was the lead he'd been chasing for days, ever since a whispered rumor hinted at a video that could change everything. "Mr. Walker," James answered, his voice tight with urgency as he pressed the phone to his ear. "You're the lawyer defending Ethan Brown, right?" Derek's voice trembled, barely audible, like he was afraid the walls themselves might overhear. "That's right," James replied, stepping away from the courthouse steps to shield the call from the wind. "I heard you might have something that could turn this case around." There was a long, agonizing pause, the faint sound of Derek's shaky breathing crackling through the line. "I recorded it," he said at last. "I was walking home that night, saw it all. That cough put something in the car. I got it on my phone." James's grip tightened, his mind racing. "You've got the video, you're sure?" "Yeah," Derek confirmed, his voice barely holding steady. "But I can't show it to anyone, not now." "Why not?" James pressed, though he already suspected the answer. Fear had a way of seeping into every corner of a case like this. "They've been after me," Derek whispered, panic creeping into his words. "Two guys came to my place yesterday, said they know where my mom lives, told me to keep my mouth shut or else." James exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm even as anger simmered beneath the surface. "Listen to me, Derek," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "That video could free Ethan and expose Jennings for what he is. I get that you're scared he'd be worried if you weren't, but let me help you. We can protect you." "I can't," Derek said, his voice breaking. "I'm not risking my family. I'm sorry." The line went dead, leaving James standing alone in the fading light, the weight of those words sinking into him. That night, he sat in his cluttered office, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. He stared at the phone, replaying Derek's terrified confession in his mind. He couldn't fault the man for backing away Jennings, and whoever was shielding him weren't playing games. But without Derek's testimony and that video, the case hung by a thread. He picked up the phone and dialed Mia. "We need to find Derek," he said the moment she answered, his voice sharp with determination. "I'm already on it," Mia replied, her tone brisk but laced with concern. "I've got a lead, but if he's gone underground, it could take time." "We don't have time," James shot back, frustration bleeding through. "Without him, we've got no direct link to Jennings planting that evidence. It's all circumstantial." Mia paused, then asked, "What's your plan if we find him?" "Convince him," James said firmly. "He needs to know we'll keep him safe." 2 days later, Mia called with an address. "He's at a motel on the edge of town," she said. "Checked in under a fake name. He's trying to stay invisible." James didn't hesitate. He drove through the night, the city lights fading into a stretch of desolate highway until he reached the rundown motel. Its neon sign flickered weakly, buzzing like a dying insect as he parked and approached Derek's door. He knocked softly, the sound muted against the distant hum of traffic. "Who is it?" Derek's voice came through, muffled and wary. "James Carter," he replied, keeping his tone steady. "I'm here to help." The door cracked open, the chain still latched, revealing Derek's haggard face. His eyes darted down the empty hallway, wide with paranoia. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed. "I know you're scared," James said, his voice low and calm, "but if you don't step up now, Jennings keeps winning. Ethan pays the pricing. This doesn't stop with him." Derek shook his head, his grip on the door tightening. "You don't get it. These people feel kill me. They're not bluffing." "They won't," James countered, his resolve unshakable. "I'll make sure you're protected. But I need you to trust me." Derek's eyes searched James's face, torn between terror and a fragile glimmer of hope. After what felt like an eternity, he unlatched the chain and stepped back, letting James inside. The room was dim, cluttered with empty takeout containers and a rumpled bedspread. Derek pulled out his phone with trembling hands and handed it over. "The video's on there," he said. "I haven't shown it to anyone." James pressed play, his breath catching as the grainy footage unfolded. There was Jennings, clear as day, slipping a small bag from his pocket and tucking it under the driver's seat of Ethan's car. It was raw, unfiltered proof, kind of evidence that could topple a liar's empire. "This is it," James said, looking up at Derek. "This changes everything." Derek rubbed his hands together, his anxiety palpable. "So what now?" "You testify," James said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Derek froze, his face paling. "No way. I gave you the video. That enough?" James shook his head. "It's powerful, but the jury needs to hear it from Yoey. You recorded it. What you saw. Without that, Jennings's team will say it's fake, edited, anything to discredit it." Derek paced the small room, his breath shallow and ragged. "I can't. You don't know what they'll do." "I do," James said, stepping forward and placing a steadying hand on Derek's shoulder. "But you've got a chance. Hereto, stop this, to keep Jennings from ruining more lives. If you don't, he'll just keep going. More people will suffer like Ethan." Derek stopped, his eyes locked on James, fear battling with a growing spark of resolve. "You promise I'll be safe?" "I promise," James said, his voice unwavering. The next day, James filed a motion to submit the video into evidence. Blake fought it tooth and nail, his voice rising in the courtroom. "This is an unverified piece of evidence, Your Honor. No chain of custody. No context. It could have been staged." James stood tall, his response cutting through the noise. "The jury deserves to see this video, and the witness who recorded it will testify to its truth. This is about justice, not games." The judge deliberated, her expression unreadable, then ruled, "The video's admissible, Mr. Carter. Ensure your witness is ready." Outside the courtroom, James turned to Mia, his jaw tight. "We need to keep Derek safe until he takes the stand." "Police protection's already in place," Mia said, her voice steady. "But if Jennings gets desperate, he will," James interrupted, his eyes narrowing. "We stay ahead of him." That evening, James met Derek at a safe house, a squat brick building tucked away under police watch. Derek sat on a worn couch, calmer now but still on edge, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "You're doing the right thing," James told him, his voice soft but firm. "This is bigger than just Ethan. It's about what happens when power goes unchecked." Derek nodded slowly, a faint resolve settling over him. "I just want it to be over." "It will be," James said, "and when it is, Jennings will answer for every lie he's told." The lesson was clear. Justice wasn't just a word thrown around in courtrooms, it was a force, hard-won and relentless, that demanded accountability. Jennings had abused his authority, believing himself untouchable. But the consequences were closing in, brick by brick, until his fortress of deceit would collapse under the weight of the truth. The courtroom buzzed with a restless energy as James Carter stood near the defense table, his posture rigid with purpose. He'd spent countless sleepless nights preparing for this moment, replaying every detail in his mind until it was etched into his very being. His dark eyes flicked toward Derek Walker, seated just behind him, whose hands fidgeted nervously in his lap. "I hope this works," James had whispered earlier that morning, his voice low and heavy with the weight of what was at stake. Derek had swallowed hard, his throat tight with a mix of fear and resolve. "It has to," he'd replied, his words trembling slightly. "Because if it doesn't, if this blows up in our face, Jennings won't just walk away. He'll bury us." James had cut him off sharply, his tone firm and unyielding. "Once that jury sees the video and hears what you have to say, there's no chance he gets out of this unscathed. The truth will hit them like a freight train." Now, as the trial unfolded, the air in the courtroom grew thick with anticipation. James stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor, and addressed the jury with a voice that carried both authority and quiet passion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his gaze sweeping across their attentive faces, "what you're about to witness isn't a theory or a guess. It's not some flimsy accusation we're tossing into the wind. It's the raw, unfiltered truth, captured in the moment it happened." He nodded toward the bailiff, who fumbled briefly with the projector before the screen flickered to life. The room dimmed, shadows stretching across the walls as every eye turned to the grainy footage about to play. Derek's hands had trembled that night as he'd held his phone, recording through the cracked window of his old pickup truck. He hadn't planned to be a hero, hadn't even wanted to get involved. But when he'd seen Officer Paul Jennings pull over Ethan Brown's beat-up sedan, on that deserted stretch of highway, something in his gut told him to stay. Now, that shaky video filled the courtroom screen, and Derek felt his chest tighten as the memory flooded back. Jennings moved with a practiced ease at first, his flashlight sweeping over the car's interior, his gloved hands shifting papers and empty coffee cups. Then came the moment, the one Derek had replayed in his nightmares ever since. Jennings paused, his broad shoulders hunching slightly as he reached into his own pocket. With a swift, deliberate motion, he pulled out a small plastic bag, its contents glinting faintly under the streetlight, and tucked it beneath the driver's seat. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The jurors leaned forward, their faces a gallery of shifting emotion, shock widening their eyes, anger tightening their jaws. One woman, a middle-aged teacher with wire-rimmed glasses, pressed a hand to her mouth, her brows knitting together in disbelief. Another juror, an older man with a weathered face, clenched his fists on the armrests of his chair, his lips pressing into a thin, furious line. Even Judge Harrow, perched high on his bench with his usual mask of impartiality, couldn't hide the faint twitch of his eyebrows as the footage played on. James let the video run its full course, every damning second stretching out in the silence. When it finally ended, the room felt like it might collapse under the weight of what they'd all just seen. James turned back to the jury, his voice steady but burning with conviction. "You saw it with your own eyes, just as I did. That bag of heroin didn't belong to Ethan Brown. It came straight from Officer Paul Jennings' pocket. This isn't just evidence, it's proof that my client was targeted, framed by a man who thought his badge gave him the power to play God." Across the room, Richard Blake, the prosecutor, rose from his seat with a forced calm that didn't quite reach his eyes. His tailored suit was impeccable, but his hands betrayed him, twitching slightly as he adjusted his tie. "Your Honor," he said, his voice smooth but edged with desperation. "This video is circumstantial at best. We have no context, no full picture of what happened that night." James whirled on him, his patience snapping like a taut wire. "The context," he shot back, his voice rising with righteous fury. "The context is crystal clear. An innocent man is sitting in that defendant's chair right now because of what we all just watched. This isn't circumstantial, it's undeniable." Murmurs swelled through the courtroom, a chaotic hum of whispers and shifting bodies. Judge Harrow raised a gnarled hand, his gavel hovering like a threat. "Order," he barked, his deep voice cutting through the noise. "Mr. Blake, you'll have your turn." "Mr. Carter, proceed." James nodded, drawing a steadying breath as he faced the jury again. Officer Jennings took an oath to protect and serve, to uphold justice. But what you saw was a betrayal of that promisea cold, calculated abuse of power. Ask yourselves this: if he was willing to plant evidence on Ethan Brown, how many others has he condemned with the same dirty tricks? How many lives has he ruined while hiding behind that badge? His words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable, as the jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Then it was Derek's turn. He climbed into the witness stand, his palms slick with sweat, his heart hammering so loud he was sure the microphone would pick it up. Richard Blake paced before him like a predator circling its prey, his sharp eyes glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Mr. Walker," Blake began, his tone dripping with skepticism, "you claim this video is authentic, but it's shaky, incomplete. It cuts off before we see anything else. Why should this jury trust a single frame of it?" Derek met his gaze, forcing his voice to stay steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "Because I was there," he said, his words ringing out with quiet strength. "I saw Jennings plant that bag with my own eyes, and I recorded it so he couldn't twist the truth later." Blake's eyes narrowed, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "But you didn't come forward right away, did you? Why the delay?" Derek hesitated, his mind flashing back to the sleepless nights, the shadowy figures lurking near his house, the anonymous calls that left his wife trembling. "Because I was terrified," he admitted, his voice softening with the weight of that truth. "Jennings had people watching me, threatening my family. I wanted to stay quiet, to keep them safe. But I couldn't live with myself knowing he was still out there doing this to someone else." Blake pounced, turning to the jury with a theatrical flourish. "So you only spoke up after the defense got to you? That sounds more like coercion than courage, doesn't it?" Before Derek could respond, James surged to his feet. "Objection," he snapped, his voice cutting through the tension. "Counsel is badgering the witness." Judge Harrow leaned forward, his stern gaze locking onto Blake. "Sustained, Mr. Blake, move on." Blake huffed, his composure slipping as he retreated to his seat. But the damage was done. Derek's honesty had struck a chord, and the jury's eyes lingered on him with a newfound respect. When Paul Jennings took the stand, the atmosphere shifted again, crackling with a tension so thick it seemed to press against the walls. James approached him, holding the USB drive like a weapon forged from truth. "Officer Jennings," he began, his tone calm but razor-sharp, "you testified under oath that the drugs found in Mr. Brown's car belonged to him. Do you still stand by that statement?" Jennings shifted in his seat, his broad frame tensing as beads of sweat glistened on his forehead. "Yes," he said, but his voice wavered, lacking the bravado it once held. "And yet," James pressed, stepping closer, "we just watched a video of you placing a bag under the driver's seat. How do you explain that?" Jennings's jaw tightened, his eyes darting toward the jury before snapping back to James. "The video doesn't show everything," he muttered, his words clipped and defensive. James tilted his head, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "Then tell us the whole story." "Officer, was that bag already in your pocket before the search?" Jennings's temper flared, his face flushing red. "No," he barked, slamming a fist against the armrest. "It's not what it looks like." James didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering. "Then what does it look like? Because to every person in this room, it looks like you planted evidence to frame an innocent man, Jennings snapped, leaning forward with a snarl. "I did my job. You don't know what it's like out there dealing with people like him, always lying, always hiding something." The courtroom erupted, a chaotic swell of gasps and murmurs. Blake buried his face in his hands, his shoulders slumping in defeat. As Judge Harrow's gavel crashed down like thunder, "Officer Jennings," the judge roared. "Compose yourself." Jennings sank back, his chest heaving, his defiance crumbling into something raw and broken. During the recess, James and his paralegal, Mia, huddled in a quiet corner of the courthouse. Mia handed him a bottle of water, her sharp eyes studying his face. "He's falling apart up there," she said, her voice low but tinged with hope. The jury saw it. They don't trust him anymore. James took a sip, the cold liquid doing little to ease the fire in his chest. "It's a start," he replied, his mind already racing ahead. "But we can't stop here. This isn't just about Ethan. It's about dragging the whole rotten system into the light showing. What happens when power turns into a weapon?" Back in the courtroom, James delivered his closing argument with a force that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice rising and falling like a preacher at the pulpit. "You've seen the video. You've heard Officer Jennings trip over his own lies. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was corruption, pure and deliberate. Ethan Brown doesn't belong in that chair. The man who put him there does." Jennings sat rigid, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. Blake, usually so poised, looked like a man watching his house burn down, helpless to stop it. As the day ended, James caught the jurors' eyes. Doubt had given way to a steely clarity, a silent promise that justice might finally prevail. Later that night, James sat alone in his cramped office, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the cluttered desk. The victory in court felt fragile, a single step in a war far from won. Jennings was cornered, but men like him were dangerous when backed into a trap. His phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. The number was unfamiliar, a string of digits that set his nerves on edge. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen. Before answering, "Carter," he said, his voice guarded. "This is Officer Ryan Taylor," came the reply, low and urgent, like a man whispering in the dark. "I need to talk to you, in person." James straightened, his pulse quickening. "Why me?" he asked, suspicion lacing his tone. "Because you're the only one who might actually do something about Jennings," Taylor said, his words heavy with exhaustion. "Meet me at Pier 17 in an hour. Come alone." The line went dead, leaving James staring at the silent phone, his mind racing with possibilities. The pier stretched out into the night, a desolate expanse of weathered wood and rusted railings. The wind off the water bit at James's skin, tugging at his coat as he approached the lone figure standing near the edge. Officer Ryan Taylor turned, his young face etched with lines of tension that made him look far older than his years. His hands were shoved deep into his jacket pockets, his shoulders hunched against the colder, perhaps against the weight of what he carried. "Taylor," James asked, his voice cutting through the sound of lapping waves. The officer nodded, his eyes darting nervously toward the shadows. "Thanks for coming," he said, his breath fogging in the chilly air. "You said you had something on Jennings," James prompted, stepping closer. "What is it?" Taylor hesitated, then pulled a worn folder from his jacket, its edges frayed from being handled too many times. "These are internal memos, reports," he said, handing it over. "They're buried deep. Only found them because I had access when I worked in the precinct. They show a pattern: Jennings's arrests, evidence disappearing, timelines that don't add up, and in some cases, cash deposits hitting his account right after big busts." James flipped through the pages, his heart pounding as the words leapt out at him. Dates, names, numbers, all painting a picture of corruption so blatant it made his stomach turn. "This is explosive," he murmured, his mind already spinning with how to wield it in court. Taylor shifted, his eyes haunted. "I'm giving it to you because I can't do this alone," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I've seen what he does show. He twists the system to protect himself. I thought I could stay quiet, keep my head down. But after today, after seeing you take him on, I couldn't anymore." James met his gaze, seeing the flicker of courage beneath the fear. "You're risking everything," he said quietly. Taylor nodded, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, but if it stops him, if it keeps one more person from suffering like Ethan did, it's worth it. As James walked back to his car, the folder tucked safely under his arm, he felt the weight of the fight settling deeper into his bones. This wasn't just about winning a case anymore. It was about tearing down a wall of lies, brick by brick, until the light of justice could finally break through. Jennings had abused his power, believing himself untouchable, but the consequences were closing in, and James would make damn sure they hit hard. The air in the precinct was heavy with the scent of stale coffee and the hum of flickering fluorescent lights. When James Carter first began to sense something was wrong, for 2 long years, he'd shared a desk across from Officer Paul Jennings, a man whose gruff demeanor and sharp tongue had initially struck James as nothing more than the mark of a seasoned cop hardened by the streets. Jennings had a way of commanding a room, broad shoulders squared, voice booming with authority that made you think twice before questioning him. At first, James chalked it up to experience, maybe even admired it a little. But as the months dragged on, cracks started to show, and what James had once dismissed as toughness began to reveal itself as something far darker. It started with the little things. A bag of cocaine Jennings claimed to have found tucked under a car seat that no one else had spotted during the sweep. A suspect's frantic pleas of innocence, swearing up and down they'd been set up, their voice trembling with a desperation that gnawed at James's gut. Then there were the whisper-shushed conversations in the locker room that stopped the moment James walked in, eyes darting away like startled birds. He told himself he was imagining it, that he was just new, paranoid, trying to find his footing. But the unease grew, a quiet storm brewing in his chest, until one day it spilled over into certainty. Taylor Bennett, a weary officer with a nervous laugh and a habit of chewing his nails down to the quick, was the one who finally broke the silence. They'd been partnered up for a late-night patrol, the city streets glistening under a fresh sheen of rain, when Taylor's voice cut through the hum of the cruiser's engine. "You ever wonder about Jennings?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the windshield, fingers drumming against the steering wheel. James turned to him, the question hanging heavy between them. "What do you mean?" he replied, though a part of him already knew. Taylor hesitated, his jaw tightening as if the words were fighting to stay locked inside. Then, in a rush, it all came tumbling out. Jennings wasn't just tough, was dirty. He'd been taking bribes for years, planting evidence to seal cases that needed to close, especially the big ones that made headlines. He'd laugh about it, Taylor said, his voice low and bitter, bragged to a few of us over beers, like it was some game he'd mastered. Said the system was built for guys like him. James felt the air leave his lungs, a cold weight settling in his stomach. Who was paying him? He pressed, his voice sharp with a mix of dread and determination. Taylor's eyes flickered to meet his, shadowed with something like shame. Sometimes it was dealers' rival crews looking to take out their competition. Other times, it was our own people, higher-ups who needed an arrest to polish their stats, make the department look good for the mayor's next press conference. The revelation hit James like a punch to the chest, knocking the wind out of him. This wasn't just one bad cop, it was a web of corruption, sprawling and tangled, stretching far beyond Jennings's smug grin. The precinct, the courts, the whole damn system, it was rotten, and James had been blind to it. "Why tell me now?" he asked, his mind racing as he tried to piece together Taylor's motives. The other man's face hardened, his knuckles whitening around the steering wheel. "Because I saw that video in court," Taylor said, his voice trembling with a quiet fury. "Jennings on tape, planting that bag in Ethan Brown's trunk like it was nothing. And I realize he's not untouchable. If you take him down, James, maybe the whole stinking mess starts to unravel." There was a fire in Taylor's eyes now, a resolve that hadn't been there before. And James felt it ignite something in himself, to a hunger for justice, a refusal to let the truth stay buried. The next morning, James marched into the courthouse with a stack of documents under his arm and a fire in his belly. He filed a motion to introduce Taylor's testimony and the evidence they'd uncover, Edmamo's reports, anything that could shine a light on Jennings's crimes. The courtroom was a battlefield that day, the air thick with tension as Prosecutor Blake Marshall leaped to his feet, his face flushed with indignation. "Your Honor," Blake barked, his voice dripping with scorn. "This is a disgraceful attempt to smear an officer of the law. Officer Taylor has no direct tie to this case, and these so-called documents are nothing but Harsian verified, unreliable, and irrelevant." He jabbed a finger toward James, his eyes blazing with accusation. James rose slowly, his posture steady as a rock, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Your Honor, this evidence isn't about one case, it's about a pattern of corruption that Officer Jennings has built his career on, a pattern that directly impacts the charges against my client, Ethan Brown. The jury has a right to know who they're dealing with here." He held Blake's gaze, unflinching. As the judge leaned back in his chair, his weathered face creased with thought. The silence stretched on, every breath in the room held captive, until finally the judge nodded. "The testimony and documents will be admitted," he said, his tone final. Blake's jaw clenched, his eyes darkening with a fury he couldn't voice. But he sank back into his seat without another word. When Taylor took the stand, the courtroom felt like it might burst from the weight of anticipation. He looked smaller up there, his uniform crisp, but his hands trembling faintly as he clasped them together. James approached, his voice calm but firm. "Officer Taylor, how long did you work with Officer Jennings?" Taylor swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. 2 years, he said, his voice steadying as he spoke. "And during that time, did you see anything that troubled you?" Taylor nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "Yes, too many times. Jennings would plant drugs, fake reports waiter it took to close a case. He'd say it was for the greater good, that the ends justified the means." James held up a memo from the pile, its edges worn from handling. "Can you tell us what this is?" Taylor leaned forward, pointing to a highlighted line with a shaky finger. "That's a report Jennings filed. Claims he found a kilo of heroin in a suspect's trunk. But when I logged it into evidence later that night, there was only half a kilo. The rest, gone." No explanation. A murmur rippled through the jury, their faces tightening with unease. "Was this a what-I'm thing?" James asked, his tone pressing. Taylor shook his head, his eyes distant. "No. It happened again and again, more times that I could keep track of." James stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "You mentioned bribes. Tell us about that." Taylor hesitated, his breath catching, then pushed forward. "Jennings took cash from dealer guys who wanted their rivals locked up. He'd plant the evidence, make the arrest, and pocket the money. He didn't even hide it. Bragged about it like it was some badge of honor." The jury shifted in their seats, a low hum of shock and anger buzzing among them. James could feel the tide turning, the weight of Taylor's words sinking into every listener. Blake's cross-examination was a storm of venom and precision. He loomed over Taylor, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Officer Taylor, you're telling us you stood by for years, watching this happen, and said nothing. And now, conveniently, when the defense is scrambling, you grow a conscience." Taylor's face flushed, his jaw locking as he fought to keep his composure. "I was scared," he admitted, his voice raw. "Jennings had the whole department in his corner, cops, brass, everyone. I didn't think anyone would listen, but that video changed things. The truth matters more than my fear now." Blake sneered, leaning in close. "Awfully convenient timing, don't you think?" Taylor's eyes flashed with defiance. "I'm here because it's right," he snapped, his voice ringing clear. After court adjourned, James and his paralegal, Mia Torres, huddled in his cluttered office, the desk buried under files and coffee cups. Mia paced the room, her dark hair bouncing with each step, her energy electric. "This is it, James," she said, her voice vibrating with excitement. "The video, Taylor's testimoniet's a knockout punch. Jennings is done." James leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his mind still churning. "Maybe," he said cautiously, "but Blake's a pit bull. He'll fight dirty to the end. We need something airtight, something they can't wiggle out of." Mia stopped, her brow furrowing. "Like what?" James's gaze drifted to the documents scattered across his desk, a plan forming in the chaos of his thoughts. "The money trail," he said, his voice firming with resolve. "If we can trace the cash Jennings took, link it to the evidence he planted, The jury won't just acquit Ethan. They'll demand the whole department answers for this. The final day of the trial dawned bright and cold. The courthouse packed to the rafters with onlookers. The gallery buzzed with nervous energy, reporters jostling for position along the back wall, their cameras poised like hawks. James stood at the defense table, his suit pressed and his expression carved from stone. Beside him sat Ethan Brown, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles gleamed white, his eyes darting between hope and terror. This was the closing argument, the moment to seal the truth in the jury's minds. James stepped forward, adjusting his jacket with a quiet confidence, and faced the jury. Their eyes locked onto him, some weary, some eager, all waiting. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady as a heartbeat, "you've heard the testimony. You've seen the evidence. And now you hold the power not just to decide Ethan Brown's fate, but to strike at the heart of a justice system that's lost its way." He paused, letting the words settle like dust after a storm. This isn't about one traffic stop gone wrong. It's about a pattern, a web of abuse spun by Officer Paul Jennings, a man who turned his badge into a weapon. The video showed you his hands planting that bag. Taylor's words showed you his soul rotted through with greed and arrogance. He turned, gesturing toward Ethan, whose head bowed slightly under the weight of the moment. "Look at him," James said, his voice softening with a raw edge. "A father who tucked his kids into bed every night. A worker who punched the clock to keep a roof over their heads. A man who trusted the law to protect him until it didn't. Because of Jennings, he lost his freedom, his pride, his future. Is that justice?" His voice rose, filling the room with a quiet thunder. But this isn't just Ethan's story. It's every voice that's been silenced, every life crushed under the boot of corruption we've ignored too long. Today, you can change that. You can say no more to Jennings, not to the system that shielded him. You can demand truth, accountability, and a law that serves, not destroys. He stepped back, his chest heaving with the force of his plea, and took his seat. The silence that followed was deafening, a heavy shroud over the room. The jury filed out to deliberate, and the wait stretched into an agonizing eternity. Ethan paced the holding area, his shoes scuffing the floor, his breath uneven. James sat still, replaying every word, every glance, searching for cracks in his argument. Hours later, the bailiff's voice broke the tension. "The jury has reached a verdict." The courtroom snapped back to life, every seat filled, every eye wide. Ethan returned, his face pale but resolute, and the judge's gavel fell like a hammer. The foreman rose, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a steady voice. "In the matter of the state versus Ethan Brown, we find the defendant not guilty." The words crashed through the room like a wave, and Ethan's shoulders slumped, his hands flying to his face as a sob broke free. James gripped his shoulder, a rare, fleeting smile crossing his lips, a quiet victory, hard won. But the judge wasn't finished. His gaze shifted, cold and unyielding, to Jennings, who sat rigid at the prosecution table, his face a mask of stone. "Officer Jennings," the judge said, his voice a blade of authority, "based on the evidence laid bare in this trial, this court is issuing an immediate warrant for your arrest, charges of evidence tampering, perjury, and obstruction of justice." The gallery erupted in gasps, a chaotic ripple of shock and whispers. Two officers stepped forward, their boots echoing on the hardwood, and Jennings shot to his feet, his composure shattering into rage. "This is a damn setup," he roared, his voice bouncing off the walls, his face red with fury. "You're all fools blind to how this game works." The officers seized his arms, forcing him back into his chair, his wrists snapping into cuffs with a metallic clank. He twisted, his eyes locking onto James, venom dripping from every word. "You think you've won, Carter. This isn't over." James met his glare, unflinching, the weight of the moment sinking deep into his bones. Jennings might rage, but the truth had broken free, and with it, the first crack in a system too long shielded by its own shadows. In the frigid air of the courtroom, James Carter stood resolute, his piercing gaze locked onto Paul Jennings. The once arrogant officer, clad in his crisp uniform that had long symbolized untouchable authority, now sat shackled, his wrists bound by the cold steel of handcuffs. "It's not over, Jennings," James declared, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, devoid of warmth or hesitation. "No, this is merely the opening chapter." As the bailiffs gripped Jennings' arms and guided him toward the exit, the room erupted into a frenzy. Flashbulbs popped like gunfire, illuminating the scene in stark, fleeting bursts, while reporters jostled against one another, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of shouted questions. Jennings kept his head low, his jaw tight with a mix of fury and humiliation, the weight of his disgrace sinking deeper with every step. For years he had wielded power with impunity, but now, in this moment, the image of his downfall burned itself into the public's memory, a potent symbol of justice, finally catching up to those who thought themselves above it. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, where a restless crowd had gathered, their anticipation buzzing like static in the air. When James and Ethan Brown emerged, the throng erupted into cheers, a wave of sound that rolled over them like thunder. Ethan, his face etched with the scars of a man who had endured unspeakable hardship, stood tall beside James, his eyes glistening with a quiet, hard-earned relief. Reporters swarmed forward, microphones thrust out like spears, their questions tumbling over one another in a chaotic rush. "Mr. Carter, how does it feel to win a case of this magnitude?" one shouted. "Do you think this will spark real reform?" another pressed. James raised a hand, his movement deliberate, silencing the clamor with the authority of someone who had stared down corruption and refused to blink. "This was never about me," he said, his voice steady and resonant, carrying over the sea of faces. "This was about justice for Ethan Brown, for every soul this broken system has crushed under its heel. Today marks a triumph, yes, but it's only the first stride on a long, treacherous road. I'm not stopping here. I'll keep fighting until the end." Beside him, Ethan nodded, his agreement a silent vow. "I'm thankful to have my life back," Ethan added, his voice softer but no less firm. "But no one should have to claw their way out of the hell I did. Let this be a warning. Change isn't just possible, it's coming." Later that evening, James sat alone in his dimly lit office, the city's glow seeping through the window in a cascade of amber and gold. The case files were closed, the verdict delivered, but an unshakable restlessness gnawed at him. Jennings' conviction was a hard-won victory, yet it felt like a single brick pried loose from a towering wall of corruption. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, his mind churning with the enormity of what still lay ahead. The door creaked open, and Mia stepped inside, her silhouette framed by the hallway's harsh light. In her hands, she carried a thick folder, its edges worn from handling. "You're still here," she observed, her tone a blend of concern and quiet reproach. James glanced up, his tired eyes meeting hers. "Just thinking," he murmured. She crossed the room and set the folder on his desk with a soft thud. "More complaints are rolling in," she said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "It's not just Jennings. People are starting to name names. They're finding the courage to speak." James nodded, a flicker of resolve igniting in his chest like a match struck in the dark. "Good," he replied, his fingers brushing the folder's cover. "The louder they get, the harder it'll be for anyone to bury this." As Mia turned to leave, James leaned back again, his thoughts already racing toward the next move. The fight for justice stretched out before him like an endless horizon. But for the first time in years, a fragile hope glimmered within reach. The ripple effect of Ethan Brown's case hit like a tidal wave, shaking the foundations of the police department Jennings had once called home. News of his conviction spread like wildfire, fanned by the breathless coverage of local papers that splashed decades of ignored grievances across their front pages. National outlets soon latched onto the story, their broadcasts amplifying the outrage until it echoed across the country. In his office, James sat hunched over his laptop, the flickering screen casting shadows across his face. As he watched the police chief's live press conference, the man stood at a podium, his face pale and drawn, beads of sweat glistening under the spotlight. In light of recent revelations, the chief intoned, his words measured and hollow, "The department will undertake a comprehensive internal review. We are committed to transparency and accountability." James let out a sharp, derisive snort, slumping back in his chair. "Committed to sweeping it under the rug, more like it," he muttered under his breath, his cynicism a shield against the platitudes. Just then, Mia entered, her arms laden with a stack of envelopes that she dropped onto his desk with a heavy thud. "More letters," she announced, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "From people claiming they were set up by Jennings by others. It's not just one bad apple, James." He reached for the pile, flipping through the pages with growing intensity. Some were scrawled in shaky handwriting, others neatly typed. But the stories they told wove a chilling tapestry, traffic stops twisted into frame-ups, confessions beaten out of the innocent, lives shattered by lies. One letter stopped him cold, a young mother's plea, her words trembling on the page as she recounted how Jennings had pinned false drug charges on her teenage son. The boy had languished in prison for 2 years before the case unraveled, the evidence too flimsy to hold. James' jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening around the paper. "This isn't just a problem," he growled. "It's a damned epidemic, and it won't stop unless we drag it into the light." Beyond the courthouse walls, the community's fury ignited into action. Protests swelled in the streets, a sea of bodies pressing against the building's stone facade, their signs bobbing like buoys in a storm. Justice for all, end police corruption. Voices rose from the crowd, raw and unfiltered, as survivors of the system's brutality stepped forward to share their pain. Among them was Marcus, a weary young man with fire in his eyes and a tremor in his voice. "What happened to Ethan could have been any of us," he shouted into a megaphone, his words slicing through the dusk. "Hell, it has happened to too many of us. The system isn't broken, it's built this way, designed to grind us down. It's time we tear it apart and start over." From the edge of the gathering, James watched, a swell of pride mingling with the iron resolve hardening in his gut. He hadn't meant to spark a revolution, but Ethan's case had lit a fuse that was now burning out of control, and he wasn't about to snuff it out. Meanwhile, the city council scrambled to respond, announcing an independent investigation into the police department. Subpoenas flew out like arrows, officers were sidelined on administrative leave, and long-buried records clawed their way into the open. The findings were staggering: hundreds of complaints against officers, most stamped dismissed without so much as a cursory glance. A special task force, headed by an outsider with a reputation for tenacity, began dissecting every case Jennings had touched over the past 10 years. One by one, the threads of a rotten system unraveled, exposing a web of complicity that stretched far beyond a single man. Late one afternoon, James' phone buzzed with a call from Linda Torres, a journalist who'd been dogging the story from the start. "Mr. Carter, this is bigger than we thought," she said, her voice crackling with urgency. "We're talking a whole network, officers covering for each other, faking evidence, silencing witnesses." Jennings was just the first domino. James leaned against his desk, the weight of her words settling into his bones. "I suspected as much," he replied grimly. "But what's the plan to stop it?" Linda's answer came sharp and clear. "That's up to the people. Keep pushing, and they'll have no choice but to listen." Back in his office, James found Ethan waiting, his posture rigid with a mix of gratitude and simmering resolve. "I heard about the investigations," Ethan said as James stepped inside, his voice steady despite the shadows under his eyes. "They're digging into Jennings and the rest." James nodded, dropping into his chair. "They are. But investigations alone won't fix this. It's going to take more." Ethan straightened, his gaze unwavering. "I want in. I can't let what happened to me keep happening to others." James studied him, searching for any crack in his determination. "You've been through the ringer, Ethan. You sure you're up for this?" Ethan's eyes hardened, a spark flaring within them. "I'm sure. I owe it to my little girl to make this world safer for her. And I owe it to myself." James extended a hand, and Ethan clasped it with a grip that sealed their pact. "Welcome to the fight," James said, a rare flicker of warmth breaking through his steely demeanor. The momentum snowballed from there. James found himself swept up in a whirlwind of demand speeches at rallies, panels with activists, consultations on other cases of suspected misconduct. At a packed community forum, he stood before a restless audience, his voice ringing out with quiet ferocity. "Change doesn't come cheap," he told them, his hands gripping the podium. "It takes grit, guts, and the will to stand tall when everything's pushing you down." We've won a skirmish, but the war for justice is still raging. Afterward, a young woman approached him, her voice quaking as she clutched a crumpled photo of her brother. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she whispered. "Jennings locked him up 3 years. Aggie's still inside. But now we've got a shot." James rested a hand on her shoulder, his touch steadying her trembling frame. "We'll get him out," he promised, "and we'll make damn sure no one else has to suffer like this." The investigations bore fruit, albeit slowly. Officers resigned in disgrace, their badges stripped away like tarnished trophies, while others faced cuffs of their own as new charges piled up. Jennings' arrest cracked open a floodgate, emboldening more victims to step forward with their stories. Yet for every step forward, obstacles loomed. Police unions cried foul, decrying the probes as witch hunts, while skeptics in the community wondered if lasting change was just a pipe dream. James refused to waver. "They're scared," he told me one evening as they pored over case files. "The clock ticking past midnight, and they damn well should be. Their days of running roughshod are numbered." But the fight took a darker turn when Ryan Taylor, a whistleblower from within the department, called late one night, his voice tight with frustration. "They're trying to bury it, James," he warned. "The brass is cutting deals, protecting their own. If they pull this off, it's all for nothing." James' grip tightened on the phone. "They won't," he shot back. "Not if we keep the heat on, keep digging. Ryan, every scrap of proof you find, we'll use to bury them instead." Months rolled by, and the spark from Ethan's case blazed into a full-fledged movement. New policies emerged, tentative steps toward transparency, body cameras mandated, a civilian oversight board established to sift through allegations of abuse. James stood at the forefront, a reluctant warrior whose quiet tenacity had made him a beacon for the cause. One evening, he and Ethan joined a rally, the crowd's chants reverberating through the night like a heartbeat. "Did you ever think it'd grow this big?" Ethan asked, his breath fogging in the chilly air as he watched the sea of faces. James shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "No, but it had to. And we're just warming up." Ethan mirrored his grin, a spark of hope lighting his weary features. "Thanks for everything, James." James met his gaze, his expression sobering. "Thank me when we've won." The story of Jennings' fall was more than a single man's reckoning. It was a searing lesson in justice and the ruinous cost of unchecked power. Every cheer from the crowd, every tearful testimony, every hard-fought reform underscored a truth as old as time: those who abuse authority sow the seeds of their own undoing. For James, Ethan, and the countless others caught in the struggle, the road ahead stretched long and uncertain, but it was a road they walked together, driven by the unshakable belief that even the mightiest walls could crumble under the weight of relentless truth. James Carter stood alone at the edge of a grand auditorium, gazing out at a sea of faces stretching before him. Hundreds of eyes locked onto his, shimmering with a blend of eager anticipation and unyielding resolve. The air buzzed with tension, thick with the weight of a cause that had spiraled far beyond its humble beginnings. What had started as a single cry for justice, sparked by Ethan Brown's ordeal, had swelled into a roaring national movement. And now James found himself thrust into its blazing heart. His fingers brushed against the microphone, adjusting it with care, and when he spoke, his voice rolled out steady and deliberate, cutting through the hum of the crowd like a blade. "Change," he began, his gaze sweeping across the room, lingering on every soul it touched, "doesn't come from the hollow echoes of a courtroom. It's forged right here, in places like this where regular folks, people like you and me, decide they've had enough. Where voices, once choked into silence, rise up, fierce and unrelenting, refusing to be brushed aside." The room erupted, a thunderclap of applause shaking the walls, but James raised a hand, firm yet gentle, quieting the storm, his brow furrowed and his tone sharpened with purpose. "I'm not standing here to bask in cheers," he pressed on, stepping closer to the edge of the stage, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "I'm here to tell you the fight's nowhere near done. We brought Paul Jennings to his knees, sure, but he was just a thread in a rotting tapestry. He was a symptom of something uglier, something festering deep, a system that thrives on hushed lips, that punishes those who dare to stand tall, that tramples the very lives it's sworn to shield." His voice grew raw, trembling with a fire he could barely contain. This isn't about settling scores. It's about holding power to account. It's about making damn sure not a single officer, not a towering institution gets to sit above the law. It's about justice, and not just for Ethan Brown, but for every soul crushed under the weight of wrong, every family ripped apart by lies. He paused, letting the silence swallow his words, watching as they sank into the crowd like stones into still water. Yo, you right there. In these seats, you've got the power to make that real. By speaking up, by demanding more, by refusing to let this flame flicker out into some forgotten headline. Together, we can carve out a system that puts truth over greed, justice over cowardice, and people over petty games. The crowd surged to their feet, their cheers crashing like waves against a cliff, a sound so mighty it seemed to rattle the very foundation beneath them. James stepped back, his chest tight, his heart hammering not just from the noise, but from the glint of steel he saw in their eyes, the unshakable belief that the world could bend toward something better. Hours later, as dusk settled over the city, he sat across from Mia in the cluttered conference room of their modest office. The walls were a chaotic gallery of charts and timelines, each line and pin a testament to the sprawling web tied to Jennings and his cronies. Mia leaned forward, her voice steady but laced with quiet triumph. "We're breaking through, James. For more resignations, to Dightwell of them are spilling everything to the task force." She tapped a list of names pinned to the wall, her finger tracing the evidence of their slow, hard-won progress. James nodded, but his eyes were fixed on a worn folder resting on the table before him. Inside lay a list of namesmen and women still languishing behind bars, their lives stolen by evidence Jennings had twisted and planted. He tapped it with a knuckle, his voice low but edged with steel. "And these people, what about them?" Mia hesitated, her fingers tightening around her pen. "The review board's digging through the cases. It's slow, but most should be overturned soon." James shook his head, his jaw tight. "Not good enough. Every sunrise they wake up in a cell is another cut against justice." Mia's gaze softened, worry creeping into her tone. "James, you can't carry all of this alone. You've already risked so much, your career, your safety." He met her eyes, unyielding. "If I don't push, Mia, who will? Someone's got to keep the fire burning." The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of a cramped meeting room where James sat surrounded by a group of young attorneys and activists, their faces alight with the raw energy of the movement. Ideas ricocheted around the table, proposals for slashing qualified immunity, blueprints for community oversight boards, demands for mandatory body cameras stitched into every uniform. James leaned forward, his voice cutting through the chatter. "This isn't just about plugging leaks in a busted dam. It's about dreaming up what justice should be. We're not here to slap bandages on a sinking wreck. We're building something new, brick by brick." A young attorney named Kayla, her sharp eyes gleaming with defiance, piped up. "How do we keep this alive? People are furious now, but fury burns out fast." James smiled faintly, a spark of grit in his expression. "We turn that heat into motion. We hit them with everything: loists, protests, votes, every lever we can pull. This isn't a quick brawl, it's a long, bruising haul. But step by step, we'll claw our way there." Weeks bled into months, and the movement stretched its roots deeper. Lawsuits piled up like kindling, policies shifted under the pressure, and officers who'd once swaggered untouchable now squirmed under the glare of investigation. But the tide didn't turn without resistance. Threats began to slither into James's life. Numberless letters slipped under his door, late-night calls with heavy breathing on the line, even cryptic warnings from old colleagues who'd once clapped him on the back. One evening, as rain drummed against the office windows, Mia looked up from a stack of case files, her voice tight. "You're stirring up hornets, James, powerful ones." He didn't flinch, his pen scratching across a page. "I'm not here to win popularity contests. I'm here to set things right." One crisp morning, a letter arrived that stopped him cold. It was from Ethan Brown, the man whose suffering had lit this fuse. Tucked inside was a photo of Ethan standing beside his daughter, her small hand clutching his, both of them beaming outside a modest new home. The note was simple, scrawled in a shaky hand. "Thank you for giving me my life back. I'll never forget what you did." James set it on his desk, his fingers lingering over the words, a quiet strength settling into his bones. This was the fuel that kept him going, yet the roar of crowds or the sting of victories. But the fragile, precious moments of lives pieced back together, of futures clawed out of the dark. And so, James Carter's battle didn't fade with one triumph. It blossomed into something vast, a movement born from Ethan's story. A piercing wake-up call that corruption only festers when the brave stay quiet. James chose to roar, to shatter the comfortable lies, to light a spark in others to do the same. The lesson was stark and unshakable. Justice isn't a gift handed down, it's a garden tended by those who dare to dig in. And the abuse of power only crumbles when the silenced find their voices. Meanwhile, across town, rain pounded the roof of James's car as he pulled into the lot of a small bank branch, where he held a silent stake as a major shareholder. The steady tap-tap of droplets on the hood mirrored the calm focus in his mind, alert, measured, ready for anything. He straightened his tie, caught a glimpse of his own determined eyes in the rearview mirror, and exhaled deeply. This wasn't about him today. It was about the institution he'd poured his faith into. Tucking his identity away like a hidden card, he grabbed a folder stuffed with papers and stepped into the downpour, striding toward the bank with the air of any ordinary man. Inside, the corporate hum swallowed him up, phones chirping, voices murmuring behind glass partitions, the air conditioner blasting a sterile chill. The receptionist flashed a practiced smile, barely glancing up. "Take a seat," she said, already reaching for the phone. Moments later, she nodded toward the manager's office. Mr. Thompson loomed behind his desk, a hulking figure with silver hair and a suit sharp enough to cut glass. He didn't bother looking up, his fingers flicking through papers with a cold disinterest. "So what do you want?" he grunted, his tone dripping with disdain, as if James's presence was a smudge on his pristine day. James eased into the chair, his demeanor unruffled, and began laying out his plan alone to grow his business, each word deliberate. His documents spread like a map of ambition. Thompson cut him off mid-sentence, his eyes raking over James with a sneer. "Look, I'll be blunt," he snapped, leaning back in his chair, his voice barbed. "Alone like that, too risky for someone like you. Stick to something smaller, something you can actually handle." The words landed like a slap, but James only nodded, offering a calm thank you as he rose, shook Thompson's limp hand, and walked out. A faint smile tugged at his lips, not from defeat, but from the predictability of it all. He'd seen this arrogance before, the kind that judged worth by a glance, and he knew it was a weed he'd one day uproot. Stepping into the rain, he adjusted his coat, tilting his face to the gray sky. For a heartbeat, he wondered if he should let it go. Then, with a flicker of that same iron will, he turned back, marching straight to the receptionist. "I'd like to see Mr. Thompson again," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. She arched a brow, sizing him up like he was begging for scraps. "I'll check," she muttered, her tone dry as she dialed. A nod later, James was back in that office, facing Thompson's scowling this time. He wouldn't leave as just another faceless name. The air in the manager's office felt thick with unspoken tension as James stepped inside, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the plush carpet. The manager, Mr. Thompson, sat behind his imposing oak desk, his posture rigid, his fingers drumming lightly against a stack of papers. When his eyes landed on James, a flicker of irritation crossed his face, though he tried to mask it beneath a veneer of professionalism. With a sigh that seemed to echo off the wood-paneled walls, he adjusted the documents in front of him, as though the mere act of dealing with James was already draining his precious time. "You again," he said, his voice dripping with a weary impatience that bordered on disdain. "I thought I'd made myself perfectly clear last time." James, undeterred, lowered himself into the leather chair across from the desk, its faint creak breaking the silence. He could feel the weight of Thompson's judgment pressing down on him, but he refused to let it show. "I believe there was a misunderstanding," he began, his tone measured yet firm, betraying none of the frustration simmering beneath the surface. "I'd like us to take a closer look at the numbers. I don't think we've had the chance to fully explore everything they're telling us." His fingers rested lightly on the folder he'd brought, a quiet symbol of his preparation and resolve. Thompson let out a soft, mocking chuckle, his head shaking as he turned to his computer, his fingers tapping rapidly on the keys. "My friend," he said, the words laced with condescension, "I've been in this game for over 2 decades. I can spot a lost cause from a mile away. Do you have any idea how many dreamers waltz through that door with their grand plans, only to leave with nothing but disappointment? You're not the first to try, and trust me, you won't be the last." His eyes flicked back to James, daring him to argue. James inhaled deeply, steadying himself against the sting of Thompson's dismissal. "I understand that, Mr. Thompson," he replied, his voice calm but resolute. "But I'm convinced the numbers tell a different story, one that could benefit us both. If we give it the attention it deserves." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering, a quiet plea for reason in the face of arrogance. Thompson's response was swift and sharp. With a flick of his wrist, he shoved the papers across the desk toward James, the sheets sliding with a faint hiss until they nearly toppled off the edge. "Do you think it's that simple?" he snapped, his tone hardening. "That you can just stroll in here and get what you want because you think you're entitled to it? That's not how this works. Frankly, I think you're overestimating yourself. This isn't a handout." His lips curled into a smirk, as though he'd just delivered an unassailable truth. James reached for the scattered papers, his movements deliberate as he gathered them back into his folder. Inside, a storm of indignation churned. Could feel the heat rising in his chest, the urge to snap back, but he swallowed it down. Thompson sat back, his expression smug, as if he believed his words had ended the conversation, his willingness to entertain James a grand act of benevolence. "I was hoping for a more thorough review," James said at last, his voice steady despite the frustration gnawing at him. "My company has a proven track record, and I'm more than ready to dive into the details." Thompson leaned forward now, elbows on the desk, his eyes narrowing as if he were about to impart some bitter wisdom. "Listen, the problem isn't the numbers or the details, it's you. People like you come through here every day, thinking they're going to rewrite the rules, turn the world upside down, but they don't get it. They don't understand how the market really works. You're not equipped to handle this kind of financial weight." His words landed like a slap, cold and deliberate, meant to cut deep. James lifted his chin, meeting Thompson's gaze head-on. Inside, he felt a flicker of defiance ignite, fueled by years of overcoming doubters just like this man. "You don't know me," he said, his voice firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You've made up your mind awfully fast. I'm trying to figure out what's really at play here, what's driving your decision." Thompson laughed again, louder this time, the sound bouncing off the walls with unrestrained mockery. "You want to know what's at play? Fine. I'll spell it out for you. It's the fact that you don't fit the mold of someone who can handle this kind of risk. It's not personal, it's just the way things are." He leaned back, crossing his arms, his confidence unshaken. But James knew better. This wasn't just about Thompson's disinterest, it was a glaring symptom of something deeper, a rot rooted in arrogance and unchecked power. He took another slow breath, mastering his tone to keep it even. "So you're saying my appearance defines my ability to manage finances?" he asked, his words sharp but controlled, a challenge wrapped in calm. Thompson shook his head, a faint, almost fatherly smile tugging at his lips. "It's not about how you look, it's about the market's reality. You might not like hearing this, but that's how the game is played. Maybe you should start smaller, aim for something more manageable." The suggestion dripped with patronizing pity, as if James were a child reaching for a toy too high on the shelf. James stood, his movements smooth and composed, refusing to let Thompson glimpse the hurt those words might have inflicted on someone less resilient. "I appreciate your candor, Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice steady as steel. "But in business, snap judgments are the quickest way to miss out on real opportunities." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. Thompson offered no reply, just a curt nod before turning back to his computer, dismissing James as if he were no more than a fleeting annoyance. "Good luck," he muttered, the words tossed over his shoulder like an afterthought as James made for the door. In the lobby, the receptionist glanced up from her desk. her eyes catching James's with a look of thinly veiled sympathy. Her fingers hovered over her keyboard, poised to resume her work. But curiosity or perhaps pity held her attention. "Didn't go well, did it?" she said, her voice low and flat, more an observation than a question. She tilted her head slightly, her auburn hair catching the fluorescent light. Her expression softened by a hint of understanding she didn't voice. James managed a small, tight smile, his pride intact despite the sting of the encounter. "Not yet," he replied, his tone light but resolute. She gave a faint shake of her head, her lips pressing into a thin line as she returned to her typing, the rhythmic clack of keys signaling the end of their brief exchange. Outside, the cool March air hit James like a wave as he stepped onto the sidewalk, the bank's sleek glass facade looming behind him. Each slow step echoed with the weight of Thompson's words, the humiliation of being dismissed so casually. He could feel the sidelong glances of the employees inside, their whispers likely buzzing through the branch like static another dreamer shot down by the mighty Mr. Thompson. But James wouldn't let their judgment define him. He knew his worth, forged not in appearances, but in the quiet victories he'd clawed from adversity over the years. As he reached his car, he paused, closing his eyes for a moment, the faint hum of traffic grounding him. A smile flickered across his face as he imagined Thompson's shock at the upcoming shareholders' meeting, a reckoning not just for James, but for a system blinded by its own biases. The days that followed were a blur of preparation, each hour spent poring over reports and refining his strategy. The meeting wasn't just about proving Thompson wrong, it was about exposing the deeper flaws in a culture that rewarded arrogance over insight, that wielded power without accountability. Justice, James thought, wasn't about revenge. It was about consequences, about forcing those who abused their authority to face the mirror of their own failures. On the morning of the meeting, James stood before his mirror, adjusting the lapels of his finest suede, a deep charcoal number that exuded understated elegance. He smoothed his tie, a muted burgundy, and met his own gaze in the reflection. This wasn't just about looking the part, it was about claiming his place as a force for change. The conference room awaited, its long table lined with executives in tailored suits, their voices a low hum of calculated chatter. Some pored over tablets, their brows furrowed over quarterly reports, while others flashed practiced smiles, trading remarks about market trends with the ease of seasoned players. James entered with purpose, his footsteps firm against the polished floor, his presence drawing nods from a few shareholders who recognized him. But the real moment would come when Thompson, seated at the far end of the table, realized the man he'd brushed off was no small-time dreamer. The bank's president kicked off the meeting with a polished speech, his voice brimming with optimism about growth and innovation, the kind of corporate rhetoric that papered over cracks. Thompson listened intently, occasionally nodding, his eagerness to shine palpable. When a pause opened in the agenda, Thompson seized his chance. Rising to present his vision for the branch, he clicked through slides with a flourish, his voice booming with enthusiasm as he touted risk management and customer service ironic. Given the disdain he'd shown James, the room offered polite applause as he finished, his chest puffed with pride. James waited, hands clasped calmly on the table, until the murmurs died down. Then he raised a hand, a simple gesture that drew the president's attention. "James Carter, please," the president said with a warm smile, his tone carrying the respect James had earned among the shareholders. "You always bring something valuable to the table." James stood slowly, the room's eyes shifting to him, a quiet electricity building. Thompson still hadn't connected the dots, his arms crossed, his face a mask of mild curiosity. "First, I'd like to commend Mr. Thompson on his presentation," James began, his voice warm and genuine. "It's obvious that controlling risk is critical to our success. But I'd like to share a recent experience at one of our branches and that stuck with me." He took a breath, his gaze sweeping the room as he recounted his visit, not naming Thompson outright, but painting the scene vividly: the manager's curt dismissal, the refusal to engage with a client's solid proposal, the reliance on snap judgments over facts. "There's a gap," he said, pausing to let the words sink in, "between what we claim to stand for and what we actually do. I was treated like an inconvenience, judged not on my merits, but on assumptions. That's not just a failure to meet's a failure to the values we're supposed to uphold. Thompson's face began to shift, a flush creeping up his neck as recognition dawned. His jaw tightened, discomfort rippling through his carefully composed facade. Around the table, executives exchanged glances, the air growing taut. The president watched. Hands steepled, his expression unreadable but attentive. James pressed on, his voice steady but forceful. When power blinds us to potential, we don't just lose clients, we lose trust. And that's a cost no bank can afford. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling like dust after a storm. For James, this wasn't just a victory over Thompson, it was a lesson in justice. A reminder that those who wield authority must answer for its misuse. The board didn't know it yet, but they were about to confront a truth they'd long ignored. Real leadership demanded respect, not just for numbers, but for the people behind them. And James, fueled by the fire of that day in Thompson's office, was ready to lead the charge. The room buzzed with the low hum of murmured conversations. As James sat at the polished conference table, his eyes steady and unwavering, he leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting through the tension like a quiet blade. "We can't keep ignoring this," he began, his tone measured but firm. "It's not enough to bury ourselves in spreadsheets or dazzle everyone with slick presentations. We've got to dig deeper, right down to how we're shaping our managers and staff, from the tellers greeting customers at the counter to the executives in their corner offices. Every single one of them needs to understand something fundamental. Treating people with dignity isn't optional. It's the heartbeat of who we are. Numbers might track our progress, but it's how we handle every soul who steps through our doors that carves out our true legacy." Across the table, Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead under the harsh fluorescent lights. His tie seemed to tighten around his neck as he cleared his throat, forcing a strained smile. "With all due respect, James," he interjected, his voice wavering just enough to betray his nerves, "I think there's been a bit of a mix-up here. Our policies are strict for a reason. We've got to protect the bank's interests, ensure everything runs smoothly. Sometimes that means tough calls." His words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain, as if he knew they wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. James raised a hand, a gentle but deliberate gesture that silenced Thompson mid-sentence. His expression remained calm, his politeness unshaken, but there was a steel beneath it that made the room feel smaller. "Mr. Thompson," he said evenly, locking eyes with the flustered manager, "you're not wrong. Gudellians matter. They're the bones of any good operation. But what we're talking about here goes beyond rules on a page. It's the soul of this Placide culture we're building. If we let that slip, if we let it twist into something cold or exclusionary, then all the excellent service we claim to offer turns into a wall that keeps people out. And that's not a bank I want to be part of." The bank's president, a gray-haired man with deep lines etched into his face from years of hard decisions, leaned forward in his chair. He nodded slowly, his fingers steepled as he absorbed James's words. "James has hit on something critical," he said, his voice gravelly but thoughtful. "We've got to take a hard look at ourselves, how we're running things, how we're training our people. Maybe it's time we put these values front and center, weave them into the fabric of everything we do." His eyes flicked briefly toward Thompson, who seemed to shrink under the weight of the moment, then back to James with a flicker of approval. James exhaled quietly, a faint sense of relief washing over him as he eased back into his chair. His point had landed not with fanfare, but with the quiet force of truth. Thompson, meanwhile, looked like a man deflating, his shoulders slumped, his usual bluster drained away, leaving him exposed. Every excuse he'd tried to muster sounded thinner than the last, crumbling against the reality James had laid bare. The lesson wasn't delivered with a raised voice or a pointed finger. It was a steady, unrelenting mirror held up to reflect what needed to change. Justice, James knew, didn't always need a gavelet, could come in the form of a conversation that left no room for denial. As the meeting rolled on, Thompson's focus frayed. His pen tapped restlessly against his notepad. His mind snagged on the exchange that had just unfolded. A memory clawed its way to the surface, sharp and humiliating. James's face, the same one he'd sneered at just a week ago when the man had walked into his office. asking for help. Thompson had dismissed him without a second thoughts of nobody. He'd assumed not worth his time. Now, that same man sat across from him, his words reshaping the room. The realization sank into Thompson like a stone, and the shame was his alone to bear. James, for his part, felt no flicker of vengeance. His chest swelled with a quieter satisfaction. Had used his voice not to settle a score, but to nudge the bank toward something better, something fairer. The meeting adjourned, and the room began to empty, shareholders filing out with murmured discussions trailing behind them. Thompson lingered, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He could feel the sidelong glances from his colleagues, some laced with pity, others with a faint edge of scorn to them. He'd misstepped in a way that might never fully wash out. James stayed seated, flipping through a stack of papers with a calm that seemed almost otherworldly. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the storm brewing in Thompson's chest. But both men knew the air between them wasn't finished crackling. Finally, Thompson pushed himself to his feet, his throat dry as he crossed the room. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice a shaky thread despite his best efforts to steady it. "I'd like a word. About what happened Eddie need to explain. If I'd known who you were." James raised a hand again, cutting him off with that same unshakable calm. His eyes met Thompson's, and there was no anger there, only a clarity that made the manager's excuses feel smaller still. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice low but piercing, "this isn't about who I am. That's the whole point. It's about how you treated Semyonyo who walked into your office looking for help. I could have been a stranger off the street, and it wouldn't change a thing. That's where we've gone wrong." Thompson's mouth opened, then closed again, words deserting him. He'd spent years behind his desk, wielding authority like a shield, always the one calling the shots. Now, stripped bare by James's quiet resolve, he felt the ground shift beneath him. Vulnerability wasn't a sensation. He knew how to navigate. I'd clawed at him, left him raw. "I get it. Mr. Carter," he managed at last, his voice trembling despite his efforts to mask it. "The bank's got rules, procedures we're bound to follow. And those procedures are tools, not excuses," James interjected, his tone still even but unyielding. "They're meant to guide us, not to hide behind. When we twist them to justify turning people away, we're not just failing our customers, we're failing everything this place stands for." Each word landed like a hammer on glass, shattering the fragile defenses Thompson had clung to. The manager's shoulders sagged further, the weight of it all pressing down until he could barely meet James's gaze. "I messed up," Thompson admitted, his voice dropping to a near whisper as he stared at the floor. "I didn't think it'd come back like this, laid out in front of everyone." The confession felt like a surrender, and in a way, it was. He'd built his career on control, on never being the one in the wrong. Now, that illusion was gone. James stood, sliding his papers into his briefcase with deliberate care. He straightened, turning to face Thompson fully, and for a moment, the manager glimpsed something beyond the polished professional, a man who carried the weight of his principles with quiet strength. "This isn't about dragging mistakes into the light," James said, his voice softening but still firm. "It's about what we do with them. We're all here to get better, but that starts with owning where we've fallen short." Thompson nodded, a small, burdened motion that carried the weight of his unraveling pride. There was no quick fix for this, no smooth talk to gloss over the crack in his armor. He'd face scrutiny, whispers in the halls, maybe worse, but beneath the dread, a faint spark flickered, something like a chance to rethink who he'd been, not just for the bank, but for himself. "I don't know if I can undo this," he said, his voice cracking at the edges, "but I want to try." A ghost of a smile touched James's lips, warm but restrained. "It's never too late to start doing right," he replied. "The trick is making sure it's real change that comes from the gut, not just the rule book." With that, he snapped his briefcase shut, the sound crisp in the emptying room. Thompson watched him go, his mind a tangle of regret and fragile resolve. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. An internal review loomed. His reputation teetered on a knife's edge. But for the first time, he felt the pull of something beyond self-preservation. In the days that followed, the bank stirred to life with change. Announcements rolled out, mandatory training on diversity and inclusion, New policies to ensure every customer felt seen and valued. The air in the branch's shift tellers smiled a little wider. Managers paused to listen a little longer. James worked quietly behind the scenes, his influence a steady hand guiding the transformation. He knew progress wasn't a straight line, but he'd planted a seed, and he'd see it through. Thompson, meanwhile, faced the fallout. A performance review stripped him of his manager's title, not fired, but demoted. A decision James had quietly pushed for. Give him a chance, he'd told the board, not out of pity, but out of a belief that consequences could forge something new. Now, in a smaller role, Thompson sat at a desk far from the corner office he'd once ruled. The downgrade stung, but it also stripped away the arrogance he'd worn like a second skin. He began to listen, to ask questions, to see the people he'd once overlooked. Weeks later, at a training event the bank had organized to cement its new values, their paths crossed again. The room buzzed with employees, the walls lined with posters about respect and equality. Thompson approached James, his steps tentative but his eyes clear. "I owe you," he said, his voice steady now, stripped of its old bravado. "Not just for keeping me here, but for showing me what I couldn't see. I want to be better." James extended a hand, his grip firm but kind. "That's leadership, Mr. Thompson," he said, "owning where we've been and stepping up to where we need to go." They shook hands. A quiet pact sealed in the hum of the room. The branch around them was changing. Employees moved with a new purpose. Customers lingered with a sense of welcome. Thompson, once a gatekeeper of exclusion, now watched it unfold with a mix of humility and hope. James stepped outside after the session, the sun glinting off the bank's sleek facade. He paused, gazing up at the name etched above the doors. A quiet pride settled in his chest, not loud, not boastful, but deep. He hadn't just righted a wrong. He'd set something in motion, a ripple of justice that would stretch beyond these walls. The lesson lingered in the air, sharp and clear. Power unchecked breeds harm, but power wielded with care can heal. And as he walked away, he knew this was only the beginning. The conference room, once a grand stage where Thompson had commanded attention with unwavering confidence, now felt shrunken and detached, as if the walls themselves had retreated from the man he used to be. A heavy cloak of shame still clung to him, its weight pressing against his shoulders. Yet beneath it burned a quiet resolve, determination, to prove he could shed the skin of his past arrogance and emerge anew. Across the table sat James, a figure of restraint and subtlety, a man who let his deeds whisper truths louder than any speech could. During a board meeting that buzzed with the hum of anticipation, James leaned forward, his voice steady but brimming with intent, proposing a mentoring program. It wasn't just about teaching newcomers the mechanics of the bank's operations. It was a vision to instill a deeper lesson that every person, from the lowliest clerk to the grandest client, deserved respect and fairness. The room warmed to the idea, heads nodding in agreement. And when they turned to James with an invitation to spearhead it, he accepted with a nod, his eyes glinting with quiet pride. As the program took root, James found himself drawn to the branch more often, not to hover over Thompson like a judge awaiting a misstep, but to witness the slow blossoming of a culture he'd helped plant. On one such visit, the air crisped with the promise of change. He stood near the teller line, observing from a distance. A young teller, her hands fumbling slightly with a stack of papers, caught his eye. Thompson approached her, his posture softer than James remembered, his voice carrying a gentle firmness instead of the dismissive bark it once held. "Listen to them first," Thompson said, his tone patient as he gestured toward the customers waiting beyond the counter. "Understand what they need before you act. It makes all the difference." The teller tilted her head, absorbing the advice with a small, grateful smile. And James felt an unexpected swell in his chest, a flicker of pride at seeing this man, who had once brushed him off with scorn, now guiding another with care. James stepped closer, keeping just enough space to respect the moment, yet near enough to catch the nuance in Thompson's words. When the lesson concluded, their eyes met, and Thompson's face broke into a shy, earnest smile, tinged with a nervous edge. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice catching slightly as he rubbed the back of his neck, "I didn't expect you here today. We're trying to do things differently, James inclined his head, his expression warm but measured. "I can see that, Mr. Thompson. You're doing well. Change isn't a straight path that twists and stumbles, but it's possible." They lingered there, exchanging thoughts on the mentoring program's steady growth. And James noted how Thompson's defenses, once a fortress of pride, had begun to crumble. His shoulders seemed lighter, as if each day stripped away another layer of the ego he'd once worn like armor, leaving room for something humbler, something truer. Then, in a moment thick with unspoken weight, Thompson drew a slow, deliberate breath, his gaze dropping to the floor before lifting to meet James's eyes. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice quieter now, threaded with a raw honesty, "I'd like to apologize again. I know I've said it before, but every day, I feel the ripple of what I did a little more. How it affected people. How it affected you." James listened, his face still, but inside, his thoughts churned. This wasn't the same apology he'd heard weeks ago, a perfunctory gesture to smooth things over. This was deeper, carved from introspection, as if Thompson had spent sleepless nights tracing the cracks his actions had left behind. "I accept it, Mr. Thompson," James replied, a genuine smile softening his features. "What matters is that you're learning from it, growing. That's the heart of it." They parted then, James casting a glance around the branch, where every small shift way a teller smiled, the way a manager paused to listen, wove together a new tapestry of trust. Thompson returned to his work, his steps lighter, his focus sharper, while James lingered at a distance, watching with a quiet satisfaction that warmed him like the late afternoon sun. Weeks later, the bank threw open its doors for a community event, a vibrant affair meant to cement its pledge to inclusion and unity. Employees mingled with managers, customers chatted over coffee, and the air buzzed with laughter and conversation. Thompson, who'd once shied away from such gatherings, threw himself into the fray, organizing tables, adjusting schedules, even stepping up to lead a workshop on empathy and service. His voice, once clipped and cold, now carried a warmth that drew people in, his hands gesturing animatedly as he spoke of understanding others' perspectives. During the event, James took the stage, the crowd hushing as he began. His words were simple but resonant, painting a picture of change as a journey, not a sprint, but a steady climb marked by stumbles and recoveries. "We learn from our missteps," he said, his gaze sweeping the room, "and we grow stronger for it. Look at what you've built here." Applause erupted, a rolling wave of sound, and James stepped back, feeling the fragile seed of hope he'd planted beginning to sprout. Afterward, Thompson approached, his eyes bright with a purpose James hadn't seen before. "I never thought I'd be here," he said, glancing at the colleagues and customers mingling around them, "part of something like this. But now it feels right." James clasped his hand, feeling the firmness of Thompson's grip, the sincerity pulsing through it. "It's a hard road," James replied, "but every step forward counts. Keep going, even when you falter." The afternoon faded into a golden glow, the event wrapping up with a sense of renewal that lingered in the air. Employees swapped stories of how the shifts in policy and attitude had lifted their spirits, how the branch felt less like a machine and more like a community. Thompson, once a solitary figure behind a desk, now moved among them, his laughter mingling with theirs, his presence a testament to the man he was becoming. As James left, his heart felt buoyant, though he knew transformation was a slow burn, fueled by patience and relentless effort. Glancing back at the branch, its windows catching the last light of day, he saw not just a building but a quiet triumph, a reminder that even the steepest obstacles could be scaled with grit and a steady hand. The months that followed brought a tide of change to the bank, its new ethos of respect and inclusion rippling outward. Customer satisfaction climbed, mirrored by a surge in employee morale, as the mentoring and training programs wove collaboration into the fabric of every level. James kept watch from afar, his sharp eyes noting each milestone, aware that the road ahead stretched long and winding. Thompson, meanwhile, embraced his role with a fervor that surprised even himself. Gone was the rigid, unyielding manager James had first encountered. In his place stood a guide, a man who shared his own stumbles and revelations with those he mentored, his voice steady with hard-earned wisdom. One unremarkable day, as James sifted through reports in his office, an invitation arrived from the bank's presidential lunch to celebrate the fruits of their labor. Over plates of steaming food and clinking glasses, the president's praise flowed freely. "James, your dedication pulled us through," he said, lifting his glass in a toast that gleamed under the chandelier's light. "Without your clarity, your stubborn resolve, we'd still be floundering." James smiled, a modest curve of his lips, though his eyes sparkled with the quiet thrill of seeing his vision take shape. "It was all of us," he said simply. Everyone chose to step up. The conversation turned to Thompson, the president marveling at his turnaround, a living proof that even the most entrenched flaws could be reshaped. James nodded, knowing this victory belonged not just to Thompson, but to every doubter who'd questioned whether change could take hold. That week, James made one final pilgrimage to the branch where it had all begun, drawn by a need to see the transformation with his own eyes. Stepping inside, he was met with smileless genuine, unforced, a far cry from the icy reception of his first visit. The receptionist, now polished with the warmth of proper training, greeted him like an old friend. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. Always good to see you." He returned the kindness, then moved deeper into the branch, where the new manager, a bright-eyed young man, greeted him with enthusiasm. Already steeped in the practices James had championed, they spoke briefly, and James felt the sincerity of the shift, a pulse of energy that hummed through the space. Wandering further, he spotted Thompson in a corner, surrounded by a small knot of employees. His voice was calm but firm, his hands tracing invisible lines in the air as he coached them through a tricky scenario, ensuring every customer left feeling heard. Seeing James, he paused, a grin breaking across his face as he strode over. "Mr. Carter," he said, his handshake solid, "we're getting there thanks to what you started." James gripped his hand in return. "I just lit the match, Mr. Thompson. You all fanned the flame." Thompson's nod was slow, deliberate, as if he finally grasped that leadership wasn't about towering over others, but about lifting them up. Before leaving, James mingled with customers in the lobby, their easy chatter and contented faces telling him more than any report could. As he stepped outside, he cast one last look at the branch, a place that had once loomed as a battleground, now a beacon of what could be achieved with effort and accountability. Sliding into his car, he exhaled, a peace settling over him. He'd learned long ago that real success wasn't measured in titles or profits, but in the quiet ripples of good he could send outward. Driving through the city's clamor, he knew challenges would keep coming, but he was armed with the same resolve and fairness that had carried him here. The bank's journey was just one thread in a larger tapestry he meant to weave, a legacy of change built not for himself, but for everyone it touched. Through it all, the lesson stood stark and clear. Justice wasn't just a verdict handed down, but a process lived out, demanding accountability. Yes, but also offering a chance at redemption. Thompson's fall from hubris had shaken him, but it was the consequences of his misuse of power that truly reshaped him, turning a once blind manager into a mirror for others. And James, with his steady hand, showed that true authority lay not in punishment, but in fostering growth, a reminder that when power falters, it's the willingness to mend it that defines the outcome.